Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something oddly appropriate about marking our position in space and time before discussing an entity whose very existence renders such coordinates meaningless. We are about to examine one of cosmic horror's most philosophically destabilizing concepts. Not a monster that can be fought, not a god that can be appeased, but a blind, idiot dreamer at the center of all reality, upon whose uninterrupted sleep the entire universe depends. Azathoth represents H.P. Lovecraft's most radical theological inversion. Not an absent god, not an indifferent god, but an unconscious god whose awakening would constitute not merely apocalypse, but ontological erasure. This documentary investigates why this particular fiction has achieved such psychological permanence, why it continues to disturb readers nearly a century after its creation, and what it reveals about our deepest anxieties regarding consciousness, meaning, and existence itself. We will trace Azathoth's literary origins through Lovecraft's fragmentary writings, examine the philosophical traditions that shaped this cosmic nightmare, and explore how this idea, that reality itself might be contingent, accidental, sustained only by something that does not know or care, has metastasized through contemporary culture. Fair warning, some ideas, once encountered, cannot be easily dismissed. The question of whether we exist by design, by accident, or by dream is not one that leaves the mind unchanged. You are already complicit. Let us proceed. Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote the fragment that would bear the name Azathoth in June of 1922, and then, significantly, abandoned it. The piece exists as a torso, a beginning without development, comprising fewer than 500 words that describe a dreamer's nightly descent into cosmic revelation. What Lovecraft left unfinished tells us as much as what he completed elsewhere. The fragment introduces us to an unnamed narrator who, night after night, finds himself transported through increasingly alien dimensions towards some ultimate source of reality, guided by a faceless guide who may or may not exist outside the dreamer's dissolving consciousness. The prose is dense, hallucinatory, preoccupied with the breakdown of stable categories. Geometry becomes unstable. Time loses linearity. The self begins to fragment. Lovecraft never returned to complete this story, but he did not abandon the concept it gestured toward. Instead, he extracted the entity itself, Azathoth, and dispersed references to it throughout his subsequent work, building mythology through strategic incompleteness rather than comprehensive explanation. This method reveals something crucial about Lovecraft's artistic intent. He understood that cosmic horror requires permanent mystery, that the most effective terrors are those that remain peripheral, implied, structurally necessary, but never fully illuminated. The entity Azathoth emerges most explicitly in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written in 1926 to 1927, where Lovecraft describes it as dwelling at the center of ultimate chaos, where the thin flutes of the ultimate void play ceaselessly around a throne occupied by the blind idiot god. This is not merely colorful language. Each word carries philosophical weight. The blindness suggests absence of perception, of intentionality, of the kind of consciousness we associate with divine providence. The idiocy, a term Lovecraft uses deliberately, indicates not mere stupidity, but a state prior to or beneath intelligence itself, a mindlessness more absolute than ignorance. The god remains nameless in function, worshipped by entities who may not even register as worshippers, sustained by music that prevents awakening rather than celebrates presence. Lovecraft's letters from this period reveal his conscious construction of a cosmology that inverts every reassuring theological principle. In correspondence with fellow writer Frank Belknap Long in 1923, Lovecraft described his emerging cosmic philosophy. All my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. Azathoth represents the ultimate expression of this premise, not an entity indifferent to humanity, but one whose very unconsciousness makes indifference impossible. We cannot be ignored by something that does not perceive. We can only accidentally persist within its dream. The historical context surrounding Azathoth's creation cannot be separated from the profound disillusionment of the post-World War I period. Lovecraft, writing in the 1920s, inhabited a world that had witnessed industrialized slaughter on an unprecedented scale, that had seen the confident certainties of Victorian progress dissolve in the trenches of Europe. The war had demonstrated that human civilization was not inevitably ascending toward enlightenment, but could instead harness rationality, science, and organizational efficiency toward annihilation. Simultaneously, developments in physics, particularly Einstein's theories of relativity and the emerging insights of quantum mechanics, were fundamentally destabilizing the Newtonian clockwork universe. Space and time proved relative rather than absolute. Matter and energy interconverted. Observation itself seemed to affect reality at quantum scales. These were not merely scientific adjustments, but philosophical earthquakes. If the universe lacked fixed reference points, if reality itself proved observer-dependent, then the ground beneath all certainty had been removed. Lovecraft, an amateur astronomer and devoted materialist, absorbed these developments with a mixture of intellectual fascination and existential horror. His cosmic fiction transforms scientific materialism into nightmare. Yes, we live in a mechanistic universe governed by impersonal laws, but what if those laws themselves are contingent? What if the mechanism is streamed rather than designed? What if consciousness, including our own, is merely an accidental byproduct of forces that neither intend nor comprehend their own existence? Lovecraft's personal philosophy evolved throughout the 1920s toward an increasingly stark cosmic pessimism. He described himself as a mechanistic materialist who rejected all supernatural claims while simultaneously recognizing that a purely material universe offered no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. This was not nihilism in the sense of advocating destruction, but rather an unflinching acknowledgement that the universe as revealed by science appeared fundamentally inhospitable to human significance. We are, in Carl Sagan's later formulation, arrangements of matter on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, but Lovecraft pushed this realization toward its most psychologically destabilizing conclusion. If we are merely matter, and matter is merely energy, and energy follows laws that contain no purpose, then our consciousness, our sense of meaning, our moral frameworks, our narratives of progress, are elaborate self-deceptions, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately as substantial as patterns in smoke. Azathoth embodies this philosophy made theological. It is the blind watchmaker taken to its logical extreme, not an absent designer, but an unconscious dreamer whose existence renders all design accidental and all meaning provisional. The progression of Azathoth through Lovecraft's work from 1922 onward demonstrates increasing confidence in the concept's horrifying implications. Early mentions are tentative, almost throwaway references in stories primarily concerned with other cosmic entities. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, however, Azathoth had become architecturally central to Lovecraft's cosmology, even while remaining descriptively peripheral to his narratives. This is crucial. Azathoth functions best as structuring absence, as the unnameable ground upon which other entities and their cults operate. Nyarlathotep serves as messenger, an active agent. Yog-Sothoth represents the gate and the key. Cthulhu dreams in Hurlia, awaiting resurrection. But Azathoth simply is, or rather, simply sleeps, and upon that sleep depends everything else. Lovecraft never wrote the story of Azathoth's awakening, never described what such an event would entail, and this refusal to dramatize constitutes the concept's greatest strength. The awakening remains permanently potential, an apocalypse perpetually deferred, a catastrophe that would not destroy reality, but reveal that reality was never stable to begin with. This is not horror that can be confronted or survived. This is horror that rewrites the category of existence itself. What Lovecraft chose not to explain about Azathoth proves as significant as what he did reveal. We never learn why Azathoth dreams, or what preceded its current state, or whether awakening is even possible in any meaningful sense. The demon flutists and drummers who surround its throne exist to prevent awakening, but Lovecraft never clarifies whether this is active prevention, a conscious effort to maintain the status quo, or merely the cosmic equivalent of white noise, sound that happens to sustain sleep without intending to do so. This ambiguity is essential. If the universe depends on Azathoth's sleep, and if that sleep depends on music, and if music depends on musicians, then we are caught in an infinite regress of contingency. Nothing possesses foundational stability. The horror is not that reality might end, but that reality might never have been anything more than an extended accident, a dream dreamed by something that does not dream intentionally, sustained by forces that do not sustain purposefully. Lovecraft understood that to explain such a system would be to domesticate it, to give readers the false comfort of comprehension. Instead, he left Azathoth as a permanent question mark at the center of his cosmology, an absence that structures everything else precisely because it cannot be filled. As we turn to examine the cultural and philosophical traditions that prepared the way for such a concept, we must recognize that Lovecraft did not create Azathoth from nothing. He synthesized ancient anxieties about creation, consciousness, and contingency into a modern mythology that continues to resonate because it articulates something we have always feared but rarely named, that existence itself might be accidental and that accidents can end. Lovecraft did not conjure Azathoth from pure imagination, but rather synthesized centuries of theological speculation, philosophical pessimism, and cosmological anxiety into a distinctly modern nightmare. The concept of a flawed or unconscious creator deity has deep roots in Western and Eastern religious thought, appearing most prominently in Gnostic Christianity's 2nd century conception of the demiurge. According to Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Secret Book of John, the material universe was not created by the true transcendent God, but by a lesser, ignorant deity called Yaldabaoth or Saklas, names meaning child of chaos and the fool, respectively. This demiurge believes itself to be the supreme God, declaring, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me," while remaining tragically unaware of the higher reality beyond its perception. The material world it creates is therefore inherently flawed, a prison of matter that traps divine sparks of consciousness in flesh. Lovecraft, though certainly not a Gnostic believer, would have encountered these ideas through his extensive reading in comparative religion and philosophy. The parallel between the Demiurge and Azathoth proves striking yet reveals a crucial distinction. Both represent unconscious or ignorant creation, divine forces that generate reality without truly comprehending what they have made. The Gnostic system, however, operates within a framework of cosmic justice and eventual redemption. The trapped divine sparks can achieve gnosis, special knowledge that liberates them from material imprisonment and returns them to the transcendent God beyond the Demiurge's flawed creation. There is hierarchy, there is purpose, there is hope. Lovecraft strips away these consolations with surgical precision. Azathoth does not even rise to the level of the Demiurge's false consciousness. It possesses no delusion of godhood, no mistaken belief in its own supremacy, because it possesses no beliefs whatsoever. It simply dreams, and we are the dream, and there is no higher reality offering escape or redemption. The Gnostic could at least hate the Demiurge as a tyrant. Against Azathoth, even hatred becomes meaningless. Eastern philosophical traditions offer even more direct parallels, particularly within Hindu cosmology's treatment of cosmic cycles and the nature of reality itself. The concept of Maya, often inadequately translated as illusion, suggests that the perceived world of distinct objects and separate beings is fundamentally misleading, a veil that obscures the true nature of unified reality. Some Hindu traditions describe the universe as Brahma's dream, with all of manifest existence unfolding within the sleeping consciousness of the creator deity during the cosmic day, only to dissolve back into undifferentiated potential during the cosmic night. The Mandukya Upanishad explores 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and transcendental awareness, and suggests that our waking reality may be no more fundamentally real than our nighttime dreams. These concepts circulated widely in Western intellectual circles during Lovecraft's era, filtered through Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy and various popular surveys of Eastern thought. Lovecraft recognized the horrifying implications of these ideas when stripped of their reassuring metaphysical frameworks. In Hindu thought, Maya operates within a larger cosmic order. The dream has purpose embedded within Dharma and Karma. Awakening leads to moksha, liberation, enlightenment, rather than annihilation. The cycles of creation and dissolution follow lawful patterns across kalpas, vast cosmic ages that repeat with mathematical precision. Human consciousness, though temporarily deluded by Maya, ultimately participates in Brahman, the universal consciousness underlying all existence. Lovecraft inverts every one of these comforts. If reality is a dream, the dreamer is mindless rather than divine. If existence is illusion, there is no Brahman behind the veil, only absence, only chaos. The awakening promises not transcendence, but erasure, not reunion with cosmic consciousness, but the revelation that consciousness itself was always accidental. We are not temporarily separated from ultimate reality. We are artifacts of its sleep, forms that cannot survive its waking. Schopenhauer's philosophy provides perhaps the most direct intellectual lineage to Lovecraft's conception of Azathoth, and Lovecraft acknowledged this debt in his letters. In The World as Will and Representation, 1818, Schopenhauer proposed that beneath the phenomenal world of appearances lies a fundamental reality he called will, a blind, purposeless, insatiable striving that generates all existence without possessing consciousness or intention. This will is not rational, not benevolent, not even coherent in any meaningful sense. It simply is, driving all manifestation through pure force devoid of purpose. Individual consciousness, in Schopenhauer's system, represents a temporary and fundamentally illusory separation from this underlying unity. We are ripples in an ocean that does not know it is an ocean, waves that mistake themselves for distinct entities while remaining nothing but water momentarily formed by forces that neither know nor care. Schopenhauer's pessimism extended to his view of existence itself as suffering, as the inevitable result of desire generated by will that can never be permanently satisfied. Lovecraft encountered Schopenhauer's philosophy in his 20s and found in it a systematic articulation of his own intuitions about cosmic meaninglessness. He wrote to fellow author Clark Ashton Smith in 1927, "Schopenhauer is probably the keenest analyst who ever lived, yet he is a supreme pessimist. Azathoth represents Schopenhauer's will made theological, elevated to the status of deity, while retaining its essential blindness, its fundamental unconsciousness, its pure existence without purpose or plan. The demon musicians surrounding Azathoth's throne might even be read as the phenomenal world itself, the surface appearance that prevents us from directly encountering the terrible will beneath, the forms and categories through which blind chaos appears temporarily ordered. Where Schopenhauer at least offered aesthetic contemplation and ascetic denial as temporary respites from will's domination, Lovecraft offers nothing. The music that keeps Azathoth sleeping is not played for our benefit, and should it cease, we do not achieve liberation. We simply cease. Immanuel Kant's epistemological revolution contributes crucial conceptual architecture to the Azathoth mythology, though Kant himself would have recoiled from Lovecraft's conclusions. Kant distinguished between phenomena, reality as it appears to us through our perceptual and cognitive apparatus, and noumena, the thing in itself that exists independently of observation but remains forever inaccessible to human knowledge. We can never know reality as it truly is, only as our minds construct it from sensory input filtered through innate categories of understanding like space, time, and causality. This insight introduced a permanent gap between consciousness and reality, suggesting that what we call the world might be radically different from whatever actually exists beyond perception. Kant maintained agnostic silence about the noumenal realm's actual nature, arguing that speculation beyond possible experience leads only to philosophical confusion. For Kant, this limitation was not cause for despair, but simply an acknowledgement of reason's proper boundaries. Lovecraft fills Kant's agnostic silence with mindless chaos, with a dreaming emptiness that accidentally generates the very categories through which we think we perceive truth. Azathoth occupies the space of the Kantian noumenon, but where Kant's thing in itself remains merely unknown, Lovecraft's proves actively incompatible with consciousness itself. As we turn to examine the specific language and symbolism Lovecraft deployed to capture this vision, we must recognize that he was working within and against centuries of human attempts to find or impose order on existence. The Gnostics sought escape from flawed creation. Hindu philosophy found unity beneath apparent multiplicity. Schopenhauer identified blind will, but offered aesthetic redemption. Kant acknowledged limits to knowledge while preserving moral autonomy. Lovecraft synthesized these traditions into a cosmology that systematically removes every consolation, every escape route, every reassuring framework that might make existence bearable. His innovation was not to propose a new answer to ancient questions about creation, consciousness, and meaning, but to suggest that consciousness itself, including the consciousness that asks questions and seeks answers, might be the ultimate cosmic accident, a temporary aberration in an unconscious dream that could end at any moment without reason, warning, or trace. The name Azathoth itself resists definitive etymological analysis, which is entirely appropriate for an entity that embodies the breakdown of meaning and classification. Lovecraft never explained the name's origin in his published writings or extensive correspondence, leaving scholars and enthusiasts to construct elaborate theories from fragmentary evidence and linguistic speculation. Some have proposed Hebrew roots, noting that Azal means to go away or to disappear, while Thoth might reference the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing, suggesting a deity of disappearing knowledge or vanishing meaning. Others point to Arabic influences, with Aza potentially relating to concepts of consolation or mourning, combined with the Thoth suffix that appears throughout Lovecraft's invented nomenclature. Still others argue the name is pure phonetic invention, constructed to sound ancient and vaguely Semitic without actually deriving from any real language. This last interpretation aligns with Lovecraft's broader practice of creating alien names that feel linguistically plausible while remaining fundamentally unrooted in human linguistic tradition. The uncertainty itself proves significant. We cannot even be certain where to locate the linguistic origins of the name, just as we cannot locate stable ontological foundations for the entity it designates. The descriptor nuclear chaos that Lovecraft attaches to Azathoth carries multiple layers of meaning that reward close examination. In Lovecraft's era, nuclear primarily meant relating to a nucleus or center, deriving from the Latin nucleus meaning kernel or core, rather than specifically referencing atomic nuclei or nuclear energy, as the term would later predominantly signify. Azathoth represents nuclear chaos in the sense of being chaos at the center, the chaotic core from which everything radiates, the kernel of meaninglessness around which apparent order accidentally arranges itself. Yet the term also evokes the atomic imagery that was beginning to enter popular consciousness in the 1920s. The idea that apparently solid matter dissolves at microscopic scales into whirling particles and empty space, that what seems stable proves fundamentally turbulent at its core. The chaos is nuclear not merely in being central, but in being constitutive, the fundamental reality from which everything else emerges and to which everything must return. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft chooses a term that suggests both cosmological centrality and atomic dissolution, both the heart of all existence and the breakdown of existence into meaningless motion. The phrase, blind idiot god, functions as perhaps Lovecraft's most philosophically dense construction, with each word performing essential conceptual work. The blindness indicates absence of perception, inability to observe or comprehend even its own existence, let alone the reality it accidentally generates through dreaming. This is not merely metaphorical blindness, the willful ignorance of a God who refuses to see, but ontological blindness, the absolute absence of the capacity for sight or any analogous perceptive faculty. The idiocy, in its original Greek sense of idios meaning private or one's own, suggests radical separation, an entity so utterly isolated that it cannot even recognize isolation, because recognition itself requires consciousness. In its modern sense, idiocy denotes profound cognitive impairment, functioning below the threshold of rational thought. Yet Azathoth exists below even this threshold, in a state prior to the possibility of cognition. The godhood remains, but stripped of every quality traditionally associated with divinity. No omniscience, no omnipotence exercised with intention, no benevolence, no justice, no awareness. What remains is pure existence combined with generative capacity, being without consciousness, power without purpose. The spatial paradox of Azathoth's throne room, at the center of ultimate chaos, deserves sustained attention for what it reveals about Lovecraft's subversion of cosmological language. Traditional cosmologies position divine thrones at specific locations: Mount Olympus, heaven above the firmament, Asgard connected by Bifrost Bridge, places that exist within spatial coordinates, even if humans cannot easily reach them. Lovecraft instead places Azathoth at a location that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that functions as geometric center while existing beyond geometry itself. The center of ultimate chaos is not a place one could navigate to given sufficient time and proper directions, but rather a logical impossibility, a coordinate that cannot exist within ordinary space because it defines the space from which ordinary space emerges. This is the nuclear chaos again, the core that is not inside anything, but from which insides and outsides, centers and peripheries, all spatial relations accidentally crystallize. To be at this center would be to exist before or beneath space itself, in a condition where location has not yet become a meaningful category. The throne imagery further intensifies the paradox. A throne suggests monarchical presence, intentional positioning, regal authority, yet this particular throne seats unconsciousness, serves no ceremonial function, commands no subjects who comprehend their service. The demon pipers and drummers who surround Azathoth's throne introduce another layer of symbolic complexity through their purely functional music making. Lovecraft describes them as playing the thin flutes of the ultimate void and beating monotonous drums, creating cacophony that serves not to celebrate or worship, but to maintain the status quo, to keep the sleeper sleeping. This inverts the traditional function of sacred music, which typically aims to attract divine attention, invoke divine presence, or express devotion toward an aware recipient. Here the music functions as cosmic white noise, as the auditory equivalent of rocking a cradle, perpetually preventing the awakening that would end everything. We must pause here to recognize what this implies. The entire universe depends not on divine will or natural law, but on maintenance, on the continued operation of forces whose purpose is purely preventive. Reality persists, not because it must or should, but because certain conditions happen to keep unconsciousness unconscious. Should the flutes cease or the drumming stop, through exhaustion, rebellion, accident, or entropy, the maintenance fails, and existence fails with it. The relationship between sound, silence, and awakening in the Azathoth mythology deserves philosophical examination beyond its immediate narrative function. Silence in religious traditions often represents the sacred, the ineffable, the pregnant void from which creation emerges, or the transcendent peace toward which consciousness strives. Lovecraft reverses this symbolism entirely. Silence in the Azathoth cosmos represents terminal threat rather than spiritual achievement. It is not the silence of meditation or mystical union, but the silence of maintenance failure, the cessation of the forces that prevent catastrophic awakening. The music, conversely, represents not harmony or beauty or devotional expression, but pure noise, meaningless, monotonous, functional. The horror lies in this inversion. What sounds like chaos, the flutes and drums, maintains order, while what resembles peace, silence, promises annihilation. The universe is not a divine symphony, expressing cosmic harmony, but rather deliberate cacophony, preventing cosmic disaster. Beauty, meaning, and order exist only as side effects of this fundamentally protective noise. The repeated invocation of dream states throughout Lovecraft's Azathoth references creates a symbolic network that systematically destabilizes the distinction between reality and unreality. Dreams, in ordinary discourse, serve as the paradigmatic example of illusion. We dream, we wake, and we recognize the dream as less real than waking consciousness. Lovecraft collapses this hierarchy. If Azathoth dreams are reality, then waking and dreaming cease to occupy clearly differentiated ontological categories. Our waking consciousness becomes merely one dream state, nested within another, itself potentially nested within others in an infinite regression of contingent realities. The horror of this symbolic structure is not that we might be dreaming. Individual humans dream regularly without existential crisis, but that reality itself might be dreamed, that existence at every scale depends on the continued sleep of something that neither knows nor cares what it dreams. The awakening that we ordinarily associate with clarity, truth, and escape from illusion becomes instead the ultimate catastrophe, the moment when the ground dissolves and everything that seemed solid proves to have been only ever vapor. As we move to examine how Lovecraft constructed narrative authenticity around this philosophically destabilizing concept, we must recognize that his symbolic language performs a kind of conceptual violence. It takes terms we use to orient ourselves in reality and systematically reveals them as provisional, contingent, sustained only by forces beyond our comprehension or control. Lovecraft's construction of Azathoth's mythology demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how fictional entities achieve cultural permanence through strategic incompleteness rather than comprehensive explanation. Unlike authors who meticulously detail their invented cosmologies, providing exhaustive histories, clear hierarchies, and definitive answers to ontological questions, Lovecraft built his cosmic pantheon through fragments, contradictions, and deliberate gaps that invite interpretation while resisting resolution. The Azathoth mythology exists across multiple texts without ever receiving complete treatment in any single narrative. We encounter the name in one story, a fragmentary description in another, a philosophical implication in a third, and we are left to assemble these pieces into something approaching coherent understanding. But the pieces never quite fit together. Gaps remain, and the assembled picture suggests vast territories beyond our comprehension. This method mirrors the experience of actual mythological research, where ancient deities survive only through scattered references in damaged texts, contradictory accounts from different cultural sources, and archaeological evidence that raises more questions than it answers. By replicating this archaeological sensation within fiction, Lovecraft creates entities that feel genuinely ancient, genuinely mysterious, genuinely real in ways that fully explained fictional creations can never achieve. The fragmentary origin text of 1922, titled simply Azathoth, functions as a brilliant exercise in suggestive incompleteness that established the template for all subsequent references. The story, if it can be called that, comprising barely 500 words, introduces an unnamed narrator who experiences nightly journeys through increasingly alien dimensions, guided by a mysterious figure who may be Nyarlathotep, towards some ultimate revelation that the text never reaches. Lovecraft abandoned this narrative mid-sentence, never completing the journey he had initiated, never revealing what awaited at the destination. Yet this abandoned fragment paradoxically achieves more than completion could have. The unfinished quality suggests that some revelations resist narration, that certain destinations cannot be reached through conventional storytelling, that the cosmic truth toward which the narrator travels exceeds the capacity of language or consciousness to process. Readers confront not just an incomplete story, but a story about incompleteness itself, about the breakdown of narrative coherence when consciousness approaches ultimate reality. The abandonment becomes interpretable as aesthetic choice rather than mere failure. Perhaps Lovecraft discovered that completing this particular story would betray its premise, that articulating the final revelation would domesticate what should remain forever alien. Lovecraft's subsequent deployment of Azathoth across multiple texts creates a cumulative mythology that gains authority through repetition with variation rather than through systematic exposition. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, we receive the most extensive description. Azathoth, dwelling at Chaos's center, surrounded by demon musicians, eternally sleeping while reality persists. In the sonnet, Azathoth, from his Fungi from Yuggoth cycle, Lovecraft provides compressed poetic treatment that emphasizes formlessness and horror without adding narrative detail. In The Whisperer in Darkness, Azathoth appears only as a name invoked by cultists, gaining menace through association and context rather than direct description. In The Haunter of the Dark, the entity remains peripheral, mentioned but not central to the narrative's cosmic revelations. This distributed presence creates the impression of an entity too vast, too fundamental to be contained within any single story. It haunts the edges of multiple narratives, acknowledged but never fully confronted, structurally necessary to the cosmology, but narratively elusive. The repetition establishes reality through familiarity, while the variation maintains mystery through irreducibility to any single authoritative account. The power of narrative absence, what Lovecraft chooses not to show or explain, proves as significant to Azathoth's effectiveness as what he does reveal. We never witness Azathoth directly through a protagonist's eyes. We never hear its voice or discern its thoughts. We never see the moment of its creation or learn what preceded its current state. We never watch the demon musicians begin their playing or discover what would happen if they stopped. These absences are not gaps to be filled by later authors or clever readers, but rather constitute essential features of the mythology itself. Azathoth functions most effectively as structuring absence, as the unseen ground upon which visible horror unfolds, as the ultimate answer that must remain unspoken, because speaking it would reduce cosmic incomprehensibility to mere incomprehension. Consider this carefully. The difference between the incomprehensible and the merely incomprehended lies in whether understanding is possible in principle. Lovecraft maintains Azathoth in the former category by refusing to provide the explanatory framework that would move it into the latter. We do not fail to understand Azathoth because we lack sufficient information. We fail because understanding itself proves categorically inappropriate to what Azathoth represents. The cross-textual mythology that Lovecraft constructed relied on what we might call strategic contradiction and productive ambiguity rather than systematic consistency. Different stories provide different details about Azathoth's court, its location, its relationship to other entities, and even its level of cosmic importance. Some texts position it as supreme deity. Others suggest it occupies merely one position within a larger pantheon of equally powerful beings. These inconsistencies, rather than weakening the mythology, actually strengthen its claim to authenticity by mimicking how real mythological systems evolve across regions, time periods, and interpretive communities. Ancient Greek mythology presents Zeus, variously, as supreme king of gods, as one Olympian among others, as cosmic principle, as anthropomorphic figure, and these variations do not invalidate the mythology, but rather demonstrate its richness, its adaptability, its resistance to single authoritative interpretation. Lovecraft achieved similar richness through similar inconsistency. Readers attempting to construct definitive accounts of Azathoth's nature confront the same challenges facing scholars of actual ancient religions: conflicting sources, ambiguous language, gaps in the textual record, questions about authorial intent versus later interpretation. Lovecraft's invention of the Necronomicon and other grimoires provides crucial supporting infrastructure for the Azathoth mythology by creating fictitious documentation that characters within stories can consult for information that readers can never access directly. The Necronomicon exists as textual ghost, repeatedly referenced, occasionally quoted, but never fully presented. We know characters read it. We hear about passages it contains, but we never actually read extended sections ourselves. This creates a two-tiered reality structure. The fictional world contains the actual Necronomicon with its comprehensive, if maddening, cosmic knowledge, while we readers exist in a second-order reality where that text remains forever inaccessible, known only through fragmentary reports filtered through unreliable narrators. Azathoth benefits enormously from this structure. Characters in stories can claim to have read about Azathoth in ancient texts, can reference specific passages or interpretations, can treat the entity as established fact within their world, and this treats it as fact attitude communicates authenticity to readers, even as we recognize we're receiving information third-hand, filtered through translation, interpretation, and the potentially compromised consciousness of narrators who have encountered cosmic truth. The false documentation strategy allows Lovecraft to have his characters speak with authority about entities while maintaining authorial ambiguity about ultimate truths. The subsequent contributions of other authors to Lovecraft's mythology demonstrate both the generative power of strategic incompleteness and the risks of excessive systematization. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and posthumous collaborator, attempted to organize the loosely connected cosmic entities into a coherent pantheon with clear hierarchies, moral alignments, and systematic relationships, Azathoth became firmly established as supreme deity. Other entities received specific portfolios and responsibilities, and the entire structure became more orderly, more comprehensible, more systematic. Many Lovecraft scholars argue this systematization betrayed the fundamental premise of cosmic horror by imposing human categories of good and evil, order and chaos, on entities that should remain beyond such categorization. Yet Derleth's work also ensured the mythology's survival and expansion, providing enough structure for other writers to contribute their own stories, while maintaining connection to Lovecraft's original vision. The tension between Lovecraft's strategic ambiguity and later authors' systematizing impulses reveals something crucial about myth building itself. Myths require sufficient structure to remain recognizable across multiple tellings while retaining sufficient flexibility to accommodate new interpretations and remain alive rather than fossilized. Azathoth has survived this tension relatively well, remaining fundamentally mysterious even as its mythology has expanded across decades of subsequent fiction, role-playing games, academic analysis, and popular culture appropriation. As we transition to examining the philosophical concepts that Azathoth embodies, we must recognize that Lovecraft's genius lay not in creating a fully realized cosmic entity, but in creating the convincing impression of an entity too vast and too alien for full realization, a God concept that gains power precisely through what remains forever unsaid, unexplained, and ultimately unsayable. The dream reality hypothesis that Azathoth embodies represents cosmic horror's most radical epistemological assault on human certainty about existence itself. Traditional philosophical skepticism questions whether we can trust our senses, whether we can know external reality with certainty, whether other minds exist beyond our own consciousness. But these skeptical positions at least grant that some reality exists, even if we cannot access it reliably. The Azathoth mythology eliminates even this minimal foundation. If all manifest reality constitutes the dream of an unconscious entity, then existence itself becomes contingent in the most absolute sense, contingent not on physical laws or divine will, but on the continued sleep of something that does not know it sleeps, does not intend to dream, and could awaken at any moment without cause or warning. This is not solipsism, where reality depends on my consciousness. This is something far more disturbing. Reality depends on an alien unconsciousness in which my existence, my consciousness, my entire framework for understanding existence proves to be an accidental byproduct. We are not the dreamers, but the dreamed, and the dreamer is mindless. The ontological dependency that this scenario creates differs fundamentally from other forms of existential contingency that philosophy has traditionally examined. Contingent beings in classical metaphysics depend on necessary beings. Humans exist contingently, while God exists necessarily. Created things depend on their creator. Effects require causes that possess greater ontological stability than themselves. The Azathoth scenario inverts this hierarchy entirely. We do not depend on something more stable than ourselves, but on something less coherent, not on perfect consciousness, but on perfect unconsciousness, not on intentional creation, but on accidental emanation. The dependency flows upward toward chaos rather than downward toward order. This creates a peculiar logical structure. If the foundation of reality is itself unstable, then everything built upon that foundation inherits and amplifies that instability. We exist not despite chaos, but because of it, not in opposition to meaninglessness, but as its direct expression. The awakening would not reveal a higher truth that our current existence obscures. It would simply end the dream and everything within it, leaving nothing, revealing nothing, signifying nothing, because there would be no consciousness remaining to register significance. The problem of consciousness in a mindless universe receives its most disturbing formulation through the Azathoth mythology. Materialist philosophy has long grappled with the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience emerges from objective matter, how qualia arise from quantitative properties, how the felt sense of being someone occurs within a universe of physical processes. Various solutions have been proposed. Emergentism suggests consciousness arises from complex material organization. Panpsychism distributes consciousness throughout reality as fundamental property. Dualism maintains consciousness and matter as separate substances. Azathoth renders all these solutions obsolete by suggesting that consciousness might be neither fundamental nor emergent, but rather dreamed, that subjective experience exists not as property of matter or spirit, but as content of an unconscious dream. This means consciousness knows itself less well than nothing. It is not merely that we fail to understand consciousness fully, but that consciousness fundamentally misunderstands its own nature by presuming it exists as something more substantial than a passing dream image. We are thoughts that mistakenly believe themselves thinkers, experiences that wrongly assume experiences, meanings that falsely presume a ground of meaningfulness. Azathoth functions as anti-teleology embodied, the systematic negation of purpose at the cosmic scale that makes all human purposes derivative from purposelessness. Teleological thinking pervades human cognition. We assume actions have goals, processes have endpoints, existence has meaning, even if we must construct that meaning ourselves. Religious teleology posits divine purpose. Evolutionary teleology, though technically a misnomer, describes adaptation toward fitness. Historical teleology imagines progress toward better futures. Personal teleology constructs life narratives with meaningful arcs. Azathoth dissolves every version of this purpose-seeking framework. If reality emerges from unconscious dreaming, then the appearance of purpose at any level, biological, psychological, historical, cosmic, represents elaborate self-deception. Natural selection operates without selecting toward anything. Human meaning, making occurs without grounding in anything meaningful. Progress moves toward nothing because movement itself lacks direction. Once we recognize the dreamer dreams without intention. The horror is not that we lack purpose in the sense of being free to create our own purposes, but that purpose as a category becomes incoherent once we trace it back to its ground in mindless chaos. Entropy embodied describes another dimension of Azathoth's philosophical significance, connecting thermodynamics to theology in ways that transform heat death from distant scientific prediction to immediate existential threat. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy, roughly disorder or unusable energy, increases in closed systems over time, suggesting the universe progresses from low entropy, organized, structured, capable of change, toward high entropy, disorganized, uniform, static. This scientific eschatology predicts far future cold death, when all stars have burned out, all energy gradients have leveled, and the universe reaches maximum entropy, where nothing further can happen. Lovecraft was familiar with these concepts from popular science writing of his era, and Azathoth can be read as entropy personified, or rather, entropy deified. The awakening represents not a singular event, but the inevitable endpoint toward which thermodynamics drives all systems, the moment when even the temporary structures that maintain appearance of order can no longer be sustained, when the dream of organization dissolves back into the chaos from which it accidentally emerged. We exist in the universe's brief window of low entropy, and that window closes not through divine judgment, but through blind physical necessity. The horror of contingent existence that Azathoth represents intensifies when we recognize how completely it undermines every framework humans have developed for dealing with existential anxiety. Death frightens us, but we develop religious narratives of afterlife, philosophical acceptance of mortality's naturalness, or simple distraction through keeping busy. Meaninglessness troubles us, but we construct personal meanings, find community, create art that seems to justify existence. Cosmic indifference disturbs us, but we take comfort in human relationships, in the fact that even if the universe doesn't care, we care about each other. Azathoth removes every one of these consolations by attacking not just life, or meaning, or care, but existence itself as potentially illusory, sustained only by accident, terminable without warning or trace. You cannot accept death philosophically if you were never truly alive in any stable sense. You cannot construct meaning if the ground for meaning construction never existed. You cannot take comfort in human connection if humans are dream images dreamed by mindlessness. This is horror that works at a level deeper than traditional fears, because it invalidates the very consciousness experiencing fear. Contemporary philosophy has developed frameworks that resonate eerily with Lovecraft's nightmare vision, even as they arrive through different routes. Simulation theory suggests we might exist within a computational simulation run by more advanced beings, raising questions about the reality status of simulated consciousness and whether simulation creators might terminate their simulations. Boltzmann brain scenarios in cosmology propose that random quantum fluctuations in an infinite universe might spontaneously generate conscious observers, complete with false memories of having existed in an orderly world, meaning your consciousness and all its contents might have popped into existence 1 second ago, complete with entirely fictional memories of a past that never happened. These contemporary thought experiments generate similar vertigo to the Azathoth mythology. Existence becomes contingent on forces that neither intend nor comprehend what they create. Consciousness cannot trust its own existence or memories. Reality might end without warning, for reasons having nothing to do with anything in reality itself. As we turn to examine the specific entities and forces involved in maintaining or threatening Azathoth's sleep, we must recognize that the philosophical concepts embodied in this mythology continue to generate genuine intellectual and psychological disturbance, precisely because they attack foundations we rarely realize we're standing on until someone, something, pulls them away. Nyarlathotep occupies a unique position within the Azathoth mythology as the entity that bridges absolute unconsciousness with active agency, functioning as messenger, interpreter, and manifestation of will from a source that possesses no will to manifest. Lovecraft describes Nyarlathotep variously as the crawling chaos, as a figure who walks among humans in deceptive forms, as the soul and messenger of the outer gods, and crucially, as the entity through which Azathoth's mindless emanations acquires something approaching purpose and direction. This relationship proves deeply paradoxical and philosophically troubling. If Azathoth possesses no consciousness, no intention, no awareness, then what exactly does Nyarlathotep represent or communicate? The most coherent interpretation suggests that Nyarlathotep functions as emergent property rather than deliberate agent, chaos given temporary form, mindlessness accidentally achieving mind, the dream developing internal consistency sufficient to generate entities that can act as though they possess agency, even though their ultimate source remains devoid of purpose. Nyarlathotep thus becomes the interface through which incomprehensible unconsciousness interacts with comprehending consciousness, the translator who speaks languages the source cannot know, the messenger who delivers communications the sender never intended, the demon court that perpetually surrounds Azathoth's throne presents another layer of cosmic dependency and recursive horror. Lovecraft describes these entities as piping and drumming ceaselessly, their music serving the essential function of maintaining Azathoth's sleep and thereby sustaining all of reality. But who or what are these musicians? The texts provide minimal detail. They are demons, presumably immortal, or at least extraordinarily long-lived, bound to their instruments and their task, without explanation of origin, motivation, or mechanism of compulsion. We might interpret them as the personification of physical laws themselves, the forces that happen to maintain current cosmic conditions, in the same sense that electromagnetic forces happen to hold atoms together, or gravitational forces happen to prevent planetary systems from flying apart. Just as we do not ask why electrons remain in orbit or what motivates gravity, perhaps we should not ask why the demon musicians play. They simply do, and their playing simply maintains the dream, and questioning the mechanism proves as futile as questioning why the universe has the physical constants it does rather than others. Yet this interpretation provides no comfort, only deeper anxiety. If reality depends on forces that operate without reason, then those forces might cease operating equally without reason. Yog-Sothoth's relationship to Azathoth reveals a hierarchy of cosmic entities that defies conventional ordering principles while suggesting terrible complementarities. Where Azathoth represents unconscious chaos at reality's center, Yog-Sothoth serves as the gate and the key, the entity coterminous with all time and space, knowing all and being all, yet somehow distinct from the nuclear chaos from which existence emerges. Lovecraft's texts describe Yog-Sothoth as omniscient, as existing simultaneously at all points in space and time, as the threshold through which entities must pass to traverse cosmic boundaries. This suggests a cosmos where pure chaos, Azathoth, and total knowledge, Yog-Sothoth, coexist without contradiction, or rather, coexist in ways that reveal knowledge and chaos as compatible rather than opposed. Yog-Sothoth knows everything, including presumably the fact that everything it knows exists only within Azathoth's dream. It is the gate, but a gate within the dream. It comprehends all, but comprehends that comprehension itself is dreamed. The relationship between these entities implies cosmic structure, more horrifying than simple chaos, a universe where perfect knowledge exists, but provides no comfort because knowledge confirms contingency, where gates exist, but lead nowhere outside the dream, where omniscience achieves nothing because there is nothing beyond the dream to achieve. lesser entities throughout Lovecraft's mythology maintain varying degrees of dependency on Azathoth's continued sleep, creating a cosmic ecosystem where even the gods fear dissolution. The great old ones, like Cthulhu, imprisoned in various locations throughout the cosmos, await resurrection and the return of conditions favorable to their dominion. But if Azathoth awakens, resurrection becomes irrelevant because existence itself ends. The elder things, the My-Go, the inhabitants of various alien worlds and dimensions all pursue their purposes, fight their wars, construct their civilizations within the larger dream without recognizing their absolute vulnerability to the dreamer's awakening. This creates a peculiar cosmic irony. Entities of immense power, virtual immortality, and vast knowledge remain as contingent as mayflies, their millennia-spanning schemes as ephemeral as human ambitions, their cosmic significance as illusory as human meaning-making. The hierarchy collapses into flatness. The difference between human consciousness lasting decades and alien consciousness lasting eons becomes meaningless when both depend equally on the continued operation of forces that could cease at any moment. We are all equally insubstantial, all equally dreamed, all equally doomed, not by any particular catastrophe, but by the structural instability of existence itself. The phenomenon of human cultists serving entities that cannot reciprocate service or even recognize being served presents a puzzle that reveals disturbing truths about consciousness and meaning-making. Throughout Lovecraft's stories, we encounter humans who worship Azathoth, perform rituals supposedly directed toward the blind idiot god, chant formulae meant to invoke or please or align themselves with ultimate chaos. But what can worship mean when directed toward unconsciousness? What can ritual achieve when the intended recipient possesses no awareness to register the ritual's performance? The cultists in Lovecraft's fiction seem to believe they serve Azathoth's purposes, but Azathoth has no purposes. They imagine they gain favor or power through devotion, but favor requires intention to bestow, and power from this source cannot be controlled because the source does not control itself. This suggests that cultism in the Lovecraft universe functions as elaborate misunderstanding, as consciousness projecting intentionality onto forces that possess none, as the desperate human need for meaning creating false narratives about entities that cannot mean anything. Yet the cultists' beliefs sometimes produce effects. They do access forbidden knowledge. They do invoke terrible forces. They do achieve results that conventional reality cannot explain. Perhaps the cult functions not as communication with Azathoth, but as a method for consciousness to partially align itself with the underlying chaos, to briefly perceive reality less filtered by comforting illusions, to glimpse the dream's edges where it borders on the dreamer's mindlessness. The Old One's fear represents perhaps the most revealing detail in the entire Azathoth mythology. The fact that even immortal, powerful, incomprehensible entities dread the awakening suggests something worse than death, worse than defeat, worse than any category of catastrophe we can readily comprehend. Lovecraft hints at this fear in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where even Nyarlathotep, who serves as Azathoth's messenger and soul, manipulates events to prevent certain revelations or disruptions that might disturb the nuclear chaos. If entities that predate human existence by millions of years, that wield power dwarfing anything terrestrial consciousness can imagine, that operate according to physics and purposes alien to our understanding. If these entities fear Azathoth's awakening, then that awakening must threaten something more fundamental than existence as they know it. The fear cannot be of death, because these entities exist beyond death in any conventional sense. The fear must be of unbecoming, of the revelation that their existence was always illusory, always contingent, always subject to termination that would retroactively erase even the fact that they had ever existed. This is horror beyond annihilation. It is the horror of discovering you were never real, that everything you experienced and achieved and understood occurred within a dream that is ending, and that the ending will leave no trace because there was never anything but dream to leave traces of. As we examine how human consciousness responds to contact with these truths and entities, we must recognize that the cosmic hierarchy Lovecraft constructs eliminates every escape. Human, alien, and God alike exist on the same fundamentally unstable ground, and that ground is Azathoth's sleep. The human mind proves categorically inadequate to comprehend Azathoth, even conceptually, not through failure of intelligence or imagination, but through structural mismatch between consciousness and what consciousness attempts to grasp. We can understand complex abstractions, infinity, entropy, quantum superposition, by building conceptual frameworks that allow us to work with ideas our direct perception cannot access. We can comprehend our own mortality despite never having experienced death, extrapolate from present to future, despite the future's non-existence, imagine alternate possibilities, despite their counterfactuality. These cognitive capacities depend on consciousness operating within certain parameters, that existence is stable, that reality possesses structure, that knowledge accumulates toward understanding. Azathoth violates every parameter simultaneously. To comprehend an unconscious dreamer, whose dream constitutes all reality, would require consciousness to step outside consciousness, to achieve perspective on existence from a vantage point that does not exist, to think about thinking in ways that invalidate thinking itself. The attempt generates not mere confusion, but cognitive collapse, not failure to understand, but the breakdown of understanding as a functional category. Those who approach genuine comprehension do not simply fail to grasp the truth. They discover their own consciousness was never equipped to grasp anything truly, that grasping itself was always illusory. The few human characters in Lovecraft's fiction who encounter even fragmentary awareness of Azathoth demonstrate consciousness protecting itself through dissolution rather than accommodation. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter journeys to the throne of chaos and receives terrible revelations from Nyarlathotep, only to be saved from full comprehension by forces that return him to safer dreams, to manageable realities where existence seems more stable than it actually is. Carter does not fully understand what he has glimpsed and retains only fragmentary, dreamlike memories that fade rather than crystallize with time. This narrative structure suggests that consciousness, when confronted with truths it cannot integrate, automatically implements protective amnesia, not through deliberate suppression, but through simple inability to retain what cannot be retained. The astronomer protagonists in various Lovecraft stories who detect cosmic patterns or calculate trajectories leading to terrible conclusions experience similar dissolutions. They see too much, their minds refuse or fail to maintain the vision, and they withdraw into madness that paradoxically protects them from the madness of full comprehension, we must pause here to recognize the recursive trap. Sanity means not knowing. Knowledge means insanity. And insanity offers no escape because the mad person still exists within the dream they now recognize as dream. Madness in the Lovecraft universe functions less as mental illness in any medical sense and more as epistemological category shift, consciousness recognizing truths about reality that destroy reality's apparent stability. Traditional psychiatric frameworks treat delusions as false beliefs maintained despite evidence. The paranoid person wrongly believes others conspire against them. The schizophrenic wrongly hears voices that do not exist externally. But what happens when the supposedly delusional beliefs prove more accurate than consensus reality? When the paranoid person correctly perceives that existence itself conspires against consciousness by being fundamentally unstable, when the voices express truths that conventional epistemology cannot acknowledge. Lovecraft's mad characters often achieve privileged access to cosmic truth precisely through their madness, seeing through comforting illusions to the chaos beneath. Yet this privileged access provides no advantage, grants no power, enables no escape. The mad seer knows reality is dreamed, but cannot undream themselves, perceives the contingency of existence, but cannot make existence necessary, recognizes the meaninglessness at the heart of meaning-making, but still must make meanings to function. Madness becomes the state of knowing too much to live normally, while knowing too little to transcend the need for normalcy. The terror of cosmic unimportance reaches its logical extreme through Azathoth in ways that dwarf traditional existential anxieties about significance. Humanist philosophy acknowledges that the universe lacks inherent human-centered meaning, while maintaining that humans can create meaning for themselves, that subjective significance possesses validity even without objective grounding. Existentialism embraces the freedom and responsibility that comes with meaning-making in an absurd universe. Even nihilism, in its most thoroughgoing forms, usually allows that we exist to confront meaninglessness, that the confrontation itself has some kind of reality, even if it has no significance. Azathoth demolishes even these minimal consolations. We cannot create meaning for ourselves if ourselves are dreamed, because the meanings we create are equally dreamed, equally contingent, equally liable to vanish without trace. We cannot take existential responsibility for our freedom if freedom and responsibility and selfhood all exist only as content of an unconscious dream. We cannot even properly confront meaninglessness because confrontation requires a confronter, and the confronter may be nothing more than a fleeting dream image that Azathoth will forget upon awakening, because Azathoth never knew it was dreaming to begin with. The unimportance is absolute. We are not merely insignificant in a vast cosmos, but potentially non-existent in any stable sense. And the difference between these categories proves more psychologically devastating than most humans can tolerate. Those rare individuals who learn the truth about Azathoth confront an impossible choice about what to do with knowledge that invalidates action itself. Several responses appear in Lovecraft's fiction and its subsequent elaborations. Some retreat into protective madness, allowing consciousness to fragment rather than maintain coherence while holding incompatible truths. Others pursue still more forbidden knowledge, as though accumulating information about the dream might somehow grant escape from being dreamed, a logical fallacy, since knowledge within the dream cannot transcend the dream, but desperation generates illogic. Still others attempt to maintain normal life despite terrible knowledge, performing routines and social roles they now recognize as ultimately hollow, going through motions that motion itself has been revealed as meaningless. A few seek death as escape, but here Azathoth presents a final horror. Suicide offers no escape if you were never alive in any stable sense, and death within the dream does not free you from the dream. The only actual escape would be Azathoth's awakening, which would free everyone by ending everyone. But this freedom more closely resembles annihilation, or rather something worse than annihilation. The revelation that there was never anything to annihilate, that existence was always absence, masquerading as presence. The difference between fearing death and fearing never having existed reveals why Azathoth generates such profound psychological disturbance compared to more conventional horrors. Death fears are universal and ancient. We fear pain, loss, separation from loved ones, termination of consciousness, missing future experiences we desire. These fears, however terrible, presume that existence preceding death possessed reality and value, that the life we fear losing was real while it lasted. Religions and philosophies offer various consolations, afterlife narratives, naturalistic acceptance that death completes life's cycle, legacy through influence on others or creative works, reincarnation, dissolution into universal consciousness. The Azathoth revelation undermines every consolation by attacking not just future existence, but past and present existence, suggesting that what we fear losing never existed stably in the first place. You cannot leave a legacy if you were never here. You cannot accept death as natural completion if your life was never natural or complete, but always contingent and illusory. You cannot take comfort in having lived well if living itself was always nothing more than being dreamed poorly by something that does not know it dreams. This transforms death fear into something more primordial, not fear of ending, but fear of never having begun, not mortality, but unreality, not loss, but the revelation that there was never anything to lose. Dissociation, derealization, and various alterations of consciousness provide the closest phenomenological analogues to what Lovecraft describes as Azathoth consciousness in his characters. Derealization, in psychiatric terms, describes the feeling that one's surroundings seem unreal, dreamlike, artificial, or distorted. People report feeling as though they're watching themselves from outside, experiencing life through a veil, perceiving reality as film or simulation rather than immediate presence. These experiences typically accompany anxiety disorders, trauma responses, or certain neurological conditions, and they cause significant distress precisely because they alienate consciousness from the reality it normally inhabits automatically. The person experiencing derealization knows intellectually that they exist and that the world is real, but this knowledge fails to translate into felt experience. Perception and cognition have somehow decoupled, leaving the person functioning but not fully present. Now imagine derealization not as symptom, but as accurate perception, not as distorted consciousness, but as consciousness perceiving actual reality clearly for the first time. This is what Lovecraft's characters experience when they glimpse Azathoth's truth. Reality becomes dreamlike because it is dream. Their sense of unreality reflects actual unreality. Their feeling of watching life from outside corresponds to the fact that there is no inside to be fully present in. The psychiatric symptom becomes philosophical revelation, and the revelation offers no cure because the condition being revealed is existence itself. As we turn to examine why this knowledge constitutes the ultimate forbidden truth, we must recognize that madness and sanity have exchanged positions. The mad see truly, while the sane maintain comforting illusions. But seeing truly provides no advantage, and perhaps constitutes the deepest disadvantage consciousness can experience. To know that reality is contingent on Azathoth's sleep represents a category of forbidden knowledge that differs fundamentally from merely dangerous information or morally compromising truths. Dangerous knowledge, how to construct weapons, manipulate psychology, exploit vulnerabilities, remains dangerous because of what can be done with it. But the knowledge itself remains stable, and the knower retains agency. Morally compromising truths, evidence of atrocities, betrayals, systematic injustices, disturb because they challenge ethical frameworks, but they operate within a reality that continues functioning according to comprehensible principles. The Azathoth revelation does neither of these things. It does not grant power, because power requires stable ground to leverage, and Azathoth's truth removes all ground. It does not morally compromise, because morality presumes agents making choices in a reality where choices have consequences, and this truth dissolves agency, choice, and consequence simultaneously. What remains is knowledge that undermines the possibility of knowing anything, information that invalidates the framework through which information becomes meaningful, truth that demonstrates truth itself as provisional arrangement within an unconscious dream. This is epistemological poison. It does not kill the knower, but corrupts knowing itself. The epistemological nightmare intensifies when we recognize that this knowledge invalidates itself in a recursive logical trap from which consciousness cannot escape. Consider the structure carefully. If all reality, including human consciousness, exists as Azathoth's dream, then all knowledge exists as dream knowledge, all reasoning as dream reasoning, all truth as dream truth. This includes the knowledge that reality is Azathoth's dream. We arrive at paradox. If the Azathoth revelation is true, then the framework through which we determine truth has been revealed as unstable, which means we cannot trust our determination that the Azathoth revelation is true, which means we return to uncertainty, except that uncertainty itself exists within the dream, and therefore proves equally unstable. We cannot bootstrap ourselves out of the dream through self-referential reasoning, because reasoning itself is dreamed. We cannot achieve Cartesian certainty through "I think therefore I am," because the thinking and the "am" both occur within contingent existence that may not exist stably. Descartes grounded certainty in the impossibility of doubting one's own doubting. But if doubt itself is dreamed, then even this foundation dissolves. The Azathoth knowledge creates infinite regress, where every attempt to establish certainty merely reveals another layer of contingency. This information proves more dangerous than any grimoire, because grimoires, however terrible their contents, operate within frameworks that allow for control, containment, or refusal. The Necronomicon describes rituals for summoning entities. Dangerous, certainly, but the danger can be avoided by not performing rituals, and the knowledge can be weaponized by those willing to accept risks. Kabbalistic texts reveal divine names and secret correspondences, powerful perhaps, but power that can be directed, hoarded, or strategically deployed. Even knowledge of how to construct terrible weapons or engineer pandemics remains, containable in principle through not acting on the knowledge, through institutional controls, through individual restraint. The Azathoth truth admits no such containment. You cannot refuse to act on it because it does not call for action. It simply describes reality, and the description cannot be unheard once heard, cannot be unthought once thought. You cannot weaponize it because it does not grant power over others or over circumstances. It merely removes the illusion of power by revealing that circumstances and others and yourself all exist contingently. You cannot lock it away because it lives in consciousness now, reframing every subsequent perception and experience through its destabilizing lens. The only containment would be forgetting. But how does one deliberately forget something when the forgetting itself would occur within the dream one now knows to be dream? The recursive horror of thinking about this knowledge manifests in how contemplation itself makes the situation worse rather than better. Normally, thinking about problems, even terrible problems, helps us process them, understand them, develop strategies for managing or accepting them. Contemplating mortality helps us prepare for death. Analyzing suffering helps us develop coping mechanisms. Studying catastrophe helps us prevent or mitigate future occurrences. Thinking about Azathoth operates inversely. Each moment spent contemplating the dream nature of reality, the unconscious dreamer, the possibility of awakening, further destabilizes the thinker's relationship to their own existence. The contemplation does not lead toward acceptance or understanding, but toward deeper alienation, more profound derealization, increasing inability to inhabit normal consciousness comfortably. This occurs because the content being contemplated attacks the process of contemplation itself. You think about the fact that thinking is dreamed, which makes the current thinking feel less real, which makes you think more carefully about whether thinking can be trusted, which further undermines thinking, spiraling downward toward cognitive paralysis. The knowledge metastasizes through consciousness, converting stable cognitive territory into unstable terrain where every thought generates doubt about thinking itself. Some ideas, once encountered, work like viruses. They replicate through being thought about. They spread by being considered. They damage by being processed. Scientific materialism confronts its worst possible confirmation through the Azathoth mythology, achieving the truth it sought while discovering that truth offers no consolation or stability. The scientific worldview since the Enlightenment has systematically displaced anthropocentric mythology. Earth is not the center of the cosmos. Humans are not specially created, but evolved. Consciousness is not immaterial soul, but physical brain process. The universe operates according to impersonal laws, without purpose or design. Each displacement removed human significance, while presumably granting more accurate understanding of reality. Materialists accept these displacements as the price of truth, arguing that mature consciousness can accept cosmic indifference without despair, can find meaning in human projects despite metaphysical meaninglessness, can build ethics without divine command. But Azathoth takes scientific materialism to its logical terminus. Yes, the universe is material, mechanical, purposeless, and material existence itself proves contingent, dreamed by mindless chaos that could end at any moment. Yes, consciousness is physical process, and physical processes are dream processes, arrangements within unconscious emanation from nuclear chaos. The materialist trades spiritual comfort for truth, only to discover that truth itself possesses no stable ground, that the physical reality materialism privileges exists as precariously as the religious narratives it displaced. We wanted to know the real without illusion. Azathoth suggests the real is illusion, sustained only by forces that do not sustain intentionally. The breakdown of meaning-making systems follows inevitably from Azathoth consciousness, because meaning depends on stability that this knowledge removes. Human meaning-making operates through narrative. We tell stories about who we are, where we came from, where we're going, what matters, and why. These narratives require temporal extension. Past informs present, present shapes future, causal connection, events relate meaningfully to other events, and ontological stability. The self telling the story and the world story describes both persist across time. The Azathoth revelation attacks every requirement simultaneously. Temporal extension becomes questionable when time itself exists as dream content. Your past may be false, memory spontaneously generated within the dream. Your future may never arrive if the dreamer awakens. Causal connection dissolves when underlying reality proves causeless, when the dream generates patterns without reason. Ontological stability evaporates when the self proves as contingent as everything else, when persistence depends on forces beyond comprehension or control. Without these requirements, meaning-making continues mechanically. We still tell stories, construct purposes, find significance, but we now recognize our meaning-making as arbitrary, as comforting fiction layered over chaos, as desperate cognitive activity that consciousness performs because it must, but that achieves nothing except temporary distraction from truth it cannot escape. Why this knowledge cannot be shared, weaponized, or controlled reveals its unique status among forbidden truths and points toward its ultimate horror. Shared knowledge typically grows less burdensome through distribution. Grief shared with others becomes more bearable. Professional burdens distributed across teams become manageable. Even terrible secrets seem less crushing when confidants know them too. The Azathoth knowledge operates inversely. Sharing it does not divide the burden, but multiplies it, creating more consciousnesses, experiencing the destabilization without reducing the original sufferer's distress. You cannot weaponize it against enemies, because enemies and allies alike exist within the same contingent dream. Destroying others' illusions provides no strategic advantage when your own existence proves equally illusory. You cannot control it through classification, institutional management, or strategic deployment, because it is not instrumental knowledge. It does not help you do anything except recognize that doing itself may be meaningless. The knowledge exists as pure psychological liability, as information that provides no benefit while imposing maximum cognitive cost. Some truths we discover should remain unknown, not because knowing violates ethics or poses danger to others, but because knowing damages the knower irreparably while benefiting no one. As we transition to examining how Lovecraft deployed this knowledge through specific literary texts, we must recognize that he understood forbidden knowledge not as power granting, but as power removing, not as secret advantage, but as cosmic disadvantage that consciousness cannot overcome, because the disadvantage is consciousness itself, recognizing its own contingency, instability, and ultimate groundlessness in an unconscious dream from which there is no waking. The 1922 fragment titled Azathoth represents Lovecraft's first attempt to articulate what would become his most philosophically radical cosmic entity, though the fragment itself never names its destination directly. The text introduces an unnamed narrator experiencing nightly journeys through increasingly alien dimensions, guided by a faceless figure towards some ultimate source. The prose emphasizes sensory breakdown and categorical dissolution. There had been aeons of silence, solitudes of infinite space, and then a burgeoning forth of light and life and consciousness. The fragment breaks off mid-revelation, abandoning the narrative at precisely the moment when complete understanding seems imminent. This structural incompleteness proves crucial. Lovecraft discovers through apparent failure that some entities resist direct narration, that cosmic horror functions more effectively through permanent deferral than through climactic revelation. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written between 1926 and 1927, provides the most extensive description of Azathoth that Lovecraft ever committed to text. Randolph Carter's quest for the Sunset City leads him beyond Earth's dreamlands into realms where gods themselves prove subject to higher powers. The crucial passage describes the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space, where the primal Nyarlathotep holds court before Azathoth, that great sultan of the monstrous cosmic gods, lording it in mindless majesty somewhere beyond the regions of matter or energy. The text emphasizes both centrality and transcendence. Azathoth sits at chaos's center, while existing beyond the categories through which location makes sense. This description establishes architectural principles for the entire mythology. Hierarchy exists, but the supreme position belongs to unconsciousness rather than supreme consciousness. The sonnet Azathoth from Lovecraft's 1929-1930 poetry cycle, Fungi from Yugoth, compresses the mythology into 14 lines of concentrated horror. The poem describes Azathoth, gnaws shapeless and ravenous amidst the muffled, maddening beat of vile drums and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes. The compression forces maximum philosophical weight into minimal language. Gnawing suggests blind consumption. Shapelessness indicates absence of stable form. Ravenous implies drive without satisfaction. The drums and flutes receive negative descriptors, vile, accursed, maddening, that emphasize their function as torment rather than music. Poetry allows Lovecraft to state boldly what prose fiction often only implies, that reality's foundation is active consumption, mindless hunger, chaos that devours without knowing it devours. Brief mentions throughout other stories create cumulative mythology through strategic repetition rather than comprehensive explanation. The Whisperer in Darkness includes Azathoth among entities invoked by cultists without providing context. The name appears amid other cosmic designations, normalized through casual reference rather than dramatic introduction. The Haunter of the Dark positions Azathoth as one reality among many accessible through the shining trapezohedron, peripheral to the narrative's immediate horror, but structurally necessary to its cosmology. These scattered references build familiarity through repetition while maintaining mystery through minimal elaboration. Readers encounter Azathoth repeatedly without ever receiving comprehensive exposition, creating the impression of an entity too vast for any single story to contain. Stories where Azathoth remains merely implied demonstrate Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding that absence generates more dread than presence. The Call of Cthulhu never mentions Azathoth directly, yet the cosmology it establishes, ancient entities awaiting conditions for their return, cults maintaining knowledge across centuries, reality proved far stranger than consensus allows, creates framework within which Azathoth's later mentions will resonate. The color out of space describes alien forces incompatible with terrestrial existence without invoking cosmic pantheon explicitly, yet the story's vision of reality susceptible to contamination by forces beyond human comprehension prepares readers conceptually for entities like Azathoth. The mythology builds not just through direct reference, but through thematic consistency across texts that train readers to recognize cosmic horror's signatures. Lovecraft's letters and essays provide crucial extra-textual context that illuminates his conscious construction of the mythology. In correspondence with August Derleth and Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft discusses his cosmic entities not as literal beings, but as imaginative symbols expressing certain basic cosmic relationships and principles. He describes Azathoth specifically as representing the blind, mindless, purposeless chaos at the center of infinity. These explicit authorial statements reveal sophisticated philosophical intent behind the fiction. Lovecraft uses narrative as vehicle for metaphysical speculation, creating stories that function simultaneously as entertainment and as thought experiments, exploring consciousness, existence, and meaning. The letters demonstrate that scattered references and strategic incompleteness represent deliberate artistic choice rather than inconsistent world-building. The progression from fragmentary origin to distributed mythology demonstrates Lovecraft's evolving confidence in handling ideas that resist conventional narrative treatment. Early attempts, like the abandoned Azathoth fragment, struggle to find form adequate to content. Middle period works, like Dream Quest, achieve descriptive success through framing devices and narrative distance. Late works assume familiarity, mentioning Azathoth casually as established cosmic fact. This evolution mirrors how actual mythologies develop, initially tentative and exploratory, gradually codifying through repetition and cultural transmission, eventually becoming so embedded that detailed explanation seems unnecessary. As we examine specific stories in detail, we must recognize that each text operates within larger intertextual network, that Lovecraft builds his mythology not through comprehensive single narratives, but through accumulation of fragmentary references that collectively suggest realities too vast for complete articulation. The dream quest of unknown Kadath occupies unique position in Lovecraft's corpus as the work that most extensively maps the cosmological hierarchy culminating in Azathoth while maintaining narrative distance that prevents full revelation. Written in 1926, 1927, but unpublished during Lovecraft's lifetime, the novella follows Randolph Carter through Earth's dreamlands, seeking the sunset city he has glimpsed in dreams, but cannot reach through ordinary dream navigation. The quest structure allows Lovecraft to construct elaborate geography of interconnected dream realms, each region revealing progressively stranger metaphysics. Carter journeys from familiar dream locations through increasingly alien territories, encountering gods, monsters, and cosmic principles that operate according to logic, fundamentally different from waking reality. The narrative progression mirrors epistemological descent. Each stage removes another layer of reassuring stability until Carter approaches the ultimate truth about reality's foundation. Carter's quest operates through escalating revelations about divine hierarchy and cosmic structure. He initially seeks the gods of Earth's dreamlands, assuming they possess the power to grant his desire. He learns these gods dwell atop unknown Kadatha, a peak hidden even from dream explorers who have mapped most dream territories. The search leads Carter to discover that Earth's gods are themselves subject to higher powers, the other gods who dwell in outer voids and do not welcome human supplication. Nyarlathotep appears as messenger and soul of these outer entities, revealing that even the cosmos Carter thought infinite proves bounded by greater infinities beyond. Finally, Carter learns that beyond the other gods lies the monstrous nuclear chaos where Azathoth dwells. This hierarchical structure inverts conventional theology. Supreme power belongs not to conscious divine will, but to unconscious divine chaos. The throne room of Azathoth receives Lovecraft's most direct descriptive treatment in all his fiction, though even here, description operates through accumulation of negatives and paradoxes rather than positive characterization. Lovecraft writes that Carter is taken beyond angled space to the throne of chaos, where the thin flutes pipe mindlessly and where Azathoth gnaws hungrily in inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, amidst the muffled, maddening beat of vile drums and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes. The spatial language breaks down. Beyond angled space suggests location outside geometric categories. Chambers that are unlighted imply not mere darkness, but absence of the possibility of illumination. The temporal qualifier, beyond time, removes even chronological coordinates. This is location as philosophical category rather than navigable place, existing nowhere because it exists prior to the categories through which where becomes meaningful. Nyarlathotep's relationship to nuclear chaos emerges as crucial mediating function between absolute unconsciousness and limited consciousness. Carter encounters Nyarlathotep in various forms throughout his journey, finally recognizing this entity serves as the soul and messenger of outer gods, including Azathoth. This messenger function proves paradoxical. How does one deliver messages from entities possessing no consciousness to formulate messages? Lovecraft suggests that Nyarlathotep represents emergent property of chaos itself, mindlessness, accidentally achieving mind sufficient to interact with conscious beings while remaining fundamentally rooted in mindlessness. The entity appears sometimes as human-like figure, sometimes as shapeless horror, demonstrating fluid identity appropriate to something serving as interface between chaos and order. Nyarlathotep can communicate, can deceive, can manipulate, all suggesting intentionality, yet serves unconscious force that possesses no intentions to serve. The scene's sensory description emphasizes horror through violation of aesthetic categories rather than through grotesque imagery. The flutes are described as thin and producing monotonous whine, the drums as muffled and beating maddeningly. These are not powerful sounds, but attenuated ones, not dramatic, but repetitive, not impressive, but oppressive. The music functions purely as maintenance, keeping Azathoth sleeping through continuous sensory input that prevents awakening. Lovecraft writes that, around the slimy-rimmed trunk of Azathoth, the thin flutes of the blind demon gods piped endlessly in the dark. The imagery combines organic corruption, slimy, with cosmic scale, trunk suggesting massive central column, while the musicians remain characterless, blind demon gods without individual identity or apparent awareness of what they maintain. The scene creates horror not through spectacular monstrosity, but through systematic removal of reassuring qualities, beauty, purpose, consciousness, stability. Carter's incomplete understanding and narrative rescue from full revelation prove essential to the story's philosophical function. He approaches the throne of chaos, but does not achieve complete comprehension of what he witnesses. Nyarlathotep simultaneously reveals and conceals, showing Carter enough to devastate his cosmic assumptions while protecting him from total epistemological collapse. Carter is eventually returned to safer dream realms, his memories of the ultimate revelation already fading to fragmentary impressions rather than systematic knowledge. This narrative structure acknowledges that consciousness cannot fully process what Carter has glimpsed. Complete understanding would destroy understanding itself. The reader receives Carter's incomplete account of incomplete experience, twice removed from direct encounter with ultimate reality. Lovecraft thus maintains philosophical coherence. Entities like Azathoth must remain incompletely known because complete knowledge would require consciousness to transcend its own categories, which is logically impossible. The theological implications embedded in the narrative restructure every conventional religious principle. Traditional monotheism positions conscious, intentional, morally concerned deity at cosmos's apex. Lovecraft positions unconscious, unintentional, amoral chaos. Traditional polytheism at least grants gods awareness of their domains and worshippers. Lovecraft's supreme entity knows nothing, including that it supremely exists. Traditional theology offers revelation as path to truth. Lovecraft's revelation destroys truth by revealing contingency at reality's foundation. The gods Carter initially sought prove powerless servants of higher powers who are themselves contingent on ultimate chaos's continued sleep. Prayer becomes useless, not because gods ignore pleas, but because ultimate power possesses no consciousness to register prayer's existence. Worship becomes cosmically irrelevant, not because it offends divine dignity, but because dignity requires consciousness to be offended. The narrative systematically removes every theological consolation while maintaining mythological structure, creating a recognizable religious architecture evacuated of religious content and filled instead with philosophical horror. As we turn to examine another major story deployment of Azathoth, we must recognize that Dream Quest establishes template for cosmic horror's fundamental move, taking familiar religious and philosophical categories and revealing them as surface patterns atop chaos that does not know it generates patterns. The Haunter of the Dark, written in 1935 as one of Lovecraft's final completed stories, approaches Azathoth through technological mediation rather than dream journey, introducing the shining trapezohedron as artifact enabling glimpses into ultimate cosmic realities. The story follows Robert Blake, a writer living in Providence who becomes obsessed with an abandoned church across the city. Blake discovers the church once housed a cult devoted to forbidden knowledge, centered around a peculiar artifact, a trapezohedron of alien geometry that functions as window into realms beyond normal perception. The narrative structure inverts Dream Quest, where Carter actively quests toward cosmic truth. Blake stumbles into revelation through antiquarian curiosity, discovering too late that some windows should remain unopened. This shift from active seeking to accidental discovery emphasizes how cosmic horror can ambush consciousness through seemingly innocent intellectual investigation. The shining trapezohedron serves as philosophical device, exploring the relationship between observation and ontological stability. Lovecraft describes it as possessing abnormal properties that brought it to the attention of those who trafficked in the esoteric. The artifact does not create alternate realities, but rather enables perception of realities existing parallel to or beneath ordinary experience. When gazed into under proper conditions, the trapezohedron reveals worlds and beings and entities normally hidden from human consciousness. Blake's research uncovers that the cult used this device to communicate with or perceive entities, including Azathoth, the nuclear chaos, described in fragmentary cult documents Blake discovers. The artifact thus functions as epistemological threat, not because it lies or distorts, but because it reveals truths consciousness cannot integrate without damage. Blake's progressive revelation and psychological descent demonstrate how cosmic knowledge operates as cognitive poison rather than mere information. Initially, Blake approaches his research with academic detachment, treating the cult's beliefs as anthropological curiosities rather than cosmological truths. He reads their documents, examines their artifact, explores their abandoned church with scholars' clinical interest. Gradually, detachment erodes as Blake's perceptions begin shifting. He notices strange lights, experiences temporal dislocations, feels presences he cannot explain through conventional categories. Lovecraft charts this descent through increasingly fragmented diary entries and letters that show Blake's prose deteriorating from clear exposition to panicked fragments. The knowledge doesn't simply frighten Blake. It progressively unmakes his ability to maintain coherent consciousness. By story's end, Blake writes in desperate, incomplete sentences about the thing in the steeple and begs correspondents to send help before the lights go out. The astronomical and cosmic horror elements merge through Blake's research into the cult's cosmology. He discovers they worshipped not the artifact itself, but what the artifact revealed, entities dwelling in the black gulfs of chaos, and particularly Azathoth, the blind idiot god. The cult's theology positioned Earth as insignificant mote within infinite cosmos, populated by entities so fundamentally alien that human categories like benevolence or malevolence prove inapplicable. Blake reads accounts describing how the beings and forces perceived through the trapezohedron exist beyond good and evil, in the sense that moral categories simply don't map onto their nature. One document Blake finds states that Azathoth represents the nuclear chaos at the center of all being, from which all things flow and to which all things return. This is not metaphorical. The cult treated these cosmological claims as literal descriptions of reality's structure. Providence as setting creates productive tension between prosaic New England geography and cosmic horror's infinite voids. Lovecraft meticulously details Providence's Federal Hill District, locating Blake's apartment, the abandoned church, various landmarks within carefully mapped real-world geography. This geographical precision makes the intrusion of cosmic horror more disturbing. The infinite chaos Azathoth represents exists not in exotic distant locale, but accessible through artifact sitting in abandoned church in ordinary American city. Blake can see the church from his window. He walks familiar streets to reach it. He climbs stairs any tourist might climb. The proximity emphasizes that cosmic horror's threat isn't distance, but dimensional. It exists not light years away, but perpendicular to normal space, accessible through perceptual shift rather than physical travel. The mundane setting also heightens tragedy. Blake dies not in alien dimension, but in his Providence apartment, killed by knowledge that traveled from infinite chaos into ordinary room. The death sequence leaves ambiguous whether Blake saw Azathoth directly or merely its secondary effects. The story's final pages comprise Blake's increasingly desperate diary entries during a period when electrical storms plunge Providence into darkness. Blake fears darkness with pathological intensity, linking it to the entity he glimpsed through the trapezohedron. His final entries describe something approaching during the darkness. The thing in the steeple sees me. I can hear the hellish whistling and piping. And help me. I cannot. Oh God, help. They're coming. The lights are going out. Black-winged things. The entries break off mid-word. Blake is found dead in his room, features frozen in expression of absolute terror. Lovecraft never definitively states what Blake saw or what killed him, maintaining ambiguity about whether the haunter is distinct entity or manifestation of Azathoth's influence breaking through dimensional barriers. The unreliable narrator convention and limits of testimony become thematic concerns rather than mere narrative technique. The story reaches us through assembled documents, Blake's diary, letters, police reports, eyewitness accounts, none providing complete picture. Each document reveals partial perspective, leaving readers to construct interpretation from fragmentary evidence, just as Blake constructed his doomed cosmology from fragmentary cult documents. This structural choice emphasizes epistemological problems the story explores. We cannot achieve certain knowledge about ultimate reality because evidence always comes filtered through limited, potentially compromised consciousness. Blake's testimony becomes suspect once his perceptions deteriorate. The cult documents might be delusional. Even police reports can only describe physical facts while remaining silent on metaphysical questions. Lovecraft thus creates narrative that formally embodies its philosophical content. Just as Blake cannot reliably know what he glimpsed, readers cannot reliably know what killed Blake, and this not knowing replicates the cosmic situation where consciousness cannot achieve stable knowledge about its own foundations. The story suggests that our epistemological limitations aren't bugs, but features, protective mechanisms, preventing consciousness from accessing truths it cannot survive knowing. Blake dies not from monster attack, but from seeing too clearly what should remain obscure. That reality connects to Azathoth's chaos more directly than comfortable ignorance allows, that the barriers between stable existence and nuclear chaos prove thinner than consciousness requires for continued stability. As we examine how other authors expanded and sometimes distorted Lovecraft's vision, we must recognize that The Haunter of the Dark demonstrates cosmic horror operating through revelation's mechanism rather than through physical threat, showing that Azathoth endangers not through action, but through being known. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology represents the most influential and controversial expansion of the Azathoth concept, fundamentally altering its philosophical implications through imposed structure. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth assumed a role as literary executor and self-appointed systematizer of what he termed the Cthulhu mythos. Derleth believed Lovecraft's scattered cosmic entities required coherent organization, clear hierarchies, and, most problematically, moral alignments. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, supposedly completed from Lovecraft fragments, Derleth positioned Azathoth as leader of malevolent outer gods opposed by benevolent elder gods in cosmic struggle between good and evil. This theological framework directly contradicts Lovecraft's philosophical materialism and his insistence that cosmic entities exist beyond human moral categories, where Lovecraft carefully maintained that Azathoth represents mindless chaos rather than evil consciousness. Derleth transformed it into something approaching traditional devil figure, intentionally malicious rather than unconsciously indifferent. The good versus evil cosmology Derleth imposed betrays cosmic horror's fundamental premise by reintroducing anthropocentric meaning into deliberately meaningless universe. Traditional religious cosmologies provide comfort through moral structure. Evil exists, but can be opposed. Darkness has corresponding light. Cosmic struggle has stakes that matter because the outcome affects human welfare. Lovecraft systematically removed these consolations by creating entities indifferent to human existence, operating according to principles that render moral categories irrelevant. Azathoth, as blind idiot god, horrifies precisely because it cannot be fought, reasoned with, or appeased. It simply is, and we contingently exist within its unconscious dream. Derleth's systematization domesticates this horror by suggesting Azathoth can be opposed by elder gods who care about cosmic order or human survival. Suddenly, the terrifying indifference becomes manageable conflict. Absolute contingency becomes cosmic drama with sides to choose and battles to win. Many scholars argue Derleth's revisions constitute fundamental misreading, importing Christian theological structures onto philosophy deliberately constructed to negate such structures. The Lurker at the Threshold demonstrates the distortion clearly through its treatment of Azathoth as actively malevolent entity requiring deliberate opposition. The novel describes Azathoth as the blind idiot god who rules the outer darkness and Lord of all things, but frames these descriptions within narrative of cultists attempting to summon Azathoth for explicitly evil purposes while protagonists work to prevent manifestation. This creates conventional horror story structure: villains pursuing dangerous goal, heroes attempting prevention, cosmic stakes depending on human action. Compare this to Lovecraft's treatment, where Azathoth simply exists as metaphysical fact beyond human influence. Nobody summons nuclear chaos at reality center. It's already there, always has been, constituting the ground from which reality accidentally emerges. The shift from ontological horror to confrontational narrative evacuates the concept's philosophical power while making it more commercially viable and narratively conventional. Derleth's Azathoth can be stories about. Lovecraft's Azathoth can only be stories structured by. Later writers have taken varied approaches to Azathoth, some attempting to recover Lovecraft's philosophical sophistication, while others embracing or extending Derleth's systematization. Ramsey Campbell's contributions to the mythos generally maintain cosmic indifference and epistemological horror, treating entities as genuinely alien rather than merely powerful. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series adopts more adventurous tone, where protagonists actively combat cosmic entities using occult knowledge and dimensional travel, positioning Azathoth as ultimate threat that can be strategically opposed through proper preparation. Thomas Ligotti's philosophical horror fiction, while rarely invoking Lovecraft's entities directly, explores similar territory of consciousness as cosmic liability and existence as fundamentally horrifying once perceived clearly. These varying approaches demonstrate tension in mythos between maintaining philosophical rigor and achieving narrative momentum. Stories need conflict, agency, stakes, but Azathoth, as Lovecraft conceived it, resists every narrative requirement by being beyond conflict, indifferent to agency, rendering all stakes ultimately meaningless. Role-playing games, particularly Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu RPG, first published in 1981, have created their own influential interpretation of Azathoth through gameplay mechanics necessity. The game statistically represents Azathoth as entity with effectively infinite attributes, encounters with which result in automatic character death or insanity. The game's rulebooks describe Azathoth as the nuclear chaos at the center of all infinity, and note that no human can comprehend Azathoth, while simultaneously providing enough mechanical definition that players can interact with the concept through gameplay. This creates interesting paradox. The game must make Azathoth narratively present and mechanically functional, while maintaining its conceptual inaccessibility. The solution typically involves treating Azathoth as ultimate forbidden truth characters might learn about, but never directly encounter. Cultists might worship it. Tomes might reference it. Mad scholars might rant about it. But actual manifestation remains beyond gameplay scope. The RPG thus returns to something like Lovecraft's approach through different route. Azathoth structures the cosmos mechanically while remaining experientially inaccessible. Modern fiction writers approaching Azathoth often foreground the epistemological and existential dimensions rather than attempting physical description or confrontational narrative. Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, reimagines Lovecraft's racism alongside his cosmic horror, maintaining cosmic indifference while interrogating who gets positioned as human versus monster. Caitlin R. Kiernan's fiction frequently explores dream reality boundaries and consciousness's instability without requiring systematic mythology. These contemporary approaches recognize that Azathoth's power derives from philosophical implications rather than narrative presence. It works better as structuring absence, as ultimate answer to cosmological questions that should remain unasked because answers destroy rather than enlighten. The best modern treatments understand Lovecraft created not adventure story villain, but thought virus, not entity to be defeated, but idea that defeats the thinking it infects by revealing thinking's groundlessness. The tension between explanation and mystery in mythos expansions reveals fundamental problem in collaborative mythology building. Lovecraft's strength came through strategic incompleteness, through maintaining ambiguity and contradiction that suggested realities too vast for systematic exposition. Each additional author adding to mythos faces choice: maintain productive mystery at risk of seeming vague or incoherent, or provide clarifying details at risk of domesticating what should remain alien. Derleth chose clarity and created something more comprehensible but less philosophically powerful. Better expansions recognize that Azathoth operates most effectively as asymptotic limit, concept toward which stories can gesture without reaching, horror suggested through implication rather than specification, question mark at cosmology's center that generates more dread than any answer could. What gets lost when mythos becomes too concrete is precisely what made it horrifying originally. The sense that we confront something genuinely incomprehensible rather than merely incomprehended. That consciousness faces not puzzle to be solved, but abyss that solves nothing while dissolving everything. As we transition to examining Azathoth's cultural afterlife beyond literature, we must recognize that the concept's power depends on maintaining productive tension between presence and absence, between enough specificity to generate horror and enough ambiguity to prevent domestication, balance easier to discuss theoretically than to achieve in actual narrative practice, which perhaps explains why Lovecraft's own treatments remain more philosophically satisfying than most subsequent elaborations. Online communities devoted to occult and paranormal topics have generated extensive folklore around alleged encounters with Azathoth or experiences that participants interpret through Lovecraftian frameworks. Forums like Reddit's r// Lovecraft and r// Occult regularly feature posts describing dreams, meditative experiences, or psychedelic visions. Users claim involve the nuclear chaos. One recurring pattern involves reports of encountering infinite piping sounds during altered states, which experiences connect to demon musicians described in Lovecraft's texts. These accounts typically emphasize sensory overwhelming, unbearable sounds, geometric impossibilities, ego dissolution beyond typical psychedelic parameters. Whether these represent genuine, anomalous experiences, sleep paralysis misinterpreted through cultural lens, or creative writing exercises remains deliberately ambiguous within these communities. The accounts function less as truth claims requiring verification and more as collaborative mythology building, where participants construct shared experiential vocabulary around cosmic horror concepts. The communities thus replicate Lovecraft's own method, building mythology through fragmentary accounts that collectively suggest realities beyond individual testimonies' capacity to capture. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977 and presenting itself as translation of Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, includes rituals supposedly enabling contact with Azathoth among other entities. The text combines Mesopotamian mythology, occult symbolism, and Lovecraftian nomenclature into system claiming pre-Christian authenticity while obviously deriving from 20th century sources. Regarding Azathoth, the book provides invocations, protective formulae, and warnings about the entity's nature that treat it as literally existing cosmic force. Chaos magic practitioners have particularly embraced this text, not because they necessarily believe its historical claims, but because they find the symbolic system psychologically effective. The philosophy behind chaos magic suggests that belief itself generates results regardless of objective truth. Of treating Azathoth as real produces desired consciousness alterations, then Azathoth functions as real within that operational framework. This pragmatic approach to cosmic horror entities creates interesting recursion. Lovecraft invented Azathoth as fictional representation of philosophical concepts. Later practitioners use the fiction as functional mythology, treating the representation as tool rather than truth, while remaining agnostic about whether something real corresponds to the representation. Astronomical coincidences and discoveries occasionally prompt speculation about cosmic horror's prophetic accuracy. The detection of supermassive black holes at galactic centers, the identification of dark matter and dark energy comprising most of the universe's mass energy, while remaining undetectable except through gravitational effects, the measurement of cosmic background radiation as echo of creation, all invite metaphorical connection to Lovecraft's nuclear chaos. Some enthusiasts point to black holes' event horizons as literal gates beyond which information cannot escape, or describe dark energy's accelerating universal expansion as cosmic dissolution prefiguring heat death. These connections typically acknowledge operating metaphorically rather than literally, yet the metaphors prove psychologically powerful. Modern cosmology does reveal a universe far stranger than pre-20th century assumptions allowed. Space-time curves, quantum mechanics introduces fundamental indeterminacy. The universe's ultimate fate remains uncertain between eternal expansion and eventual collapse. While actual cosmology doesn't confirm Azathoth's existence, it does confirm Lovecraft's intuition that scientific materialism leads toward disturbing rather than comforting visions of reality's nature. Chaos magic practitioners specifically invoke Azathoth in rituals designed to disrupt habitual consciousness patterns and access altered states productive of personal transformation. Within chaos magic theory, entities like Azathoth function as what practitioners call egregores, thought forms given power through collective belief and ritual attention. The chaos magician might construct elaborate ritual invoking Azathoth, not because they believe a literal blind idiot god exists at Cosmos' center, but because engaging deeply with this symbol generates useful psychological effects: ego dissolution, confrontation with meaninglessness, recognition of existence's contingency. Advanced practitioners sometimes report experiences during such rituals that exceed their explanatory frameworks: dissociative states, perception of impossible geometries, encounters with presences that seem autonomous rather than self-generated. These reports create interpretive ambiguity. Did the ritual access something genuinely external, or did it successfully trick consciousness into experiencing its own depths as alien? The question remains unresolvable, and chaos magic philosophy suggests the question matters less than the experiential results achieved through practice. Dream reports claiming Azathoth encounters populate online communities, raising questions about collective unconscious versus cultural contamination. Users describe recurring nightmares involving impossible spaces, overwhelming sounds, the sense of approaching something that will end not just the dreamer, but the dream itself. Some report waking with inexplicable dread that persists for days, or experiencing temporary derealization where ordinary reality seems unstable or contingent. Skeptical analysis suggests these experiences result from exposure to Lovecraft's concepts. The brain incorporates cultural material into dream content, and disturbing ideas generate disturbing dreams without requiring supernatural explanation. Yet some experiences insist their encounters preceded any knowledge of Lovecraft, discovering cosmic horror fiction later and recognizing described entities as matching their spontaneous visions. This creates chicken-egg puzzle. Do people dream of chaos because culture transmitted the concept? Or does culture transmit the concept because people independently access similar experiences? Carl Jung might argue for archetypal patterns, explaining why blind idiot god imagery resonates across cultures. Materialist psychology would emphasize social transmission and selection bias. The psychology of feeling, Azathoth's presence, reveals how Conceptual horror can generate somatic and emotional responses typically associated with immediate threats. Readers report experiencing genuine existential dread while contemplating the implications of reality as unconscious dream, developing intrusive thoughts about existence's contingency that interfere with normal functioning, or suffering depersonalization episodes where their own consciousness feels unreal or borrowed. These responses occur despite intellectual recognition that Azathoth remains fictional. The philosophical implications generate anxiety independent of literal belief. This suggests cosmic horror accesses deep psychological vulnerabilities around meaning, stability, and existence itself. We evolved in environments where immediate physical threats required fear responses. Cosmic horror triggers similar responses to conceptual threats that cannot be fled or fought. The amygdala responds to existential destabilization, much as it responds to predators, generating fight or flight, activation for situation, permitting neither fighting nor fleeing. Some individuals develop genuine phobias around cosmic horror concepts, avoiding texts or discussions that might trigger renewed anxiety about reality's fundamental instability. Why people want to believe in cosmic horror presents fascinating psychological puzzle given the concept's deeply disturbing nature. Several factors likely contribute: intellectual rebellion against comforting narratives, choosing harsh truth over pleasant lies; aesthetic appreciation for philosophical rigor taken to extreme conclusions; subcultural identity formation around shared dark knowledge; and paradoxically, a form of meaning-seeking through embracing meaninglessness. Believing or semi-believing in cosmic horror provides narratives, community, and sense of possessing special knowledge. Even if that knowledge destroys conventional meaning, it creates alternative framework for understanding existence. There's also element of control through naming. Azathoth, as concept, makes cosmic indifference specific, bounded, comprehensible, even while representing incomprehensibility. Better to face nuclear chaos with a name than to confront raw existential vertigo without vocabulary. Some practitioners report that engaging deliberately with cosmic horror concepts paradoxically reduces anxiety. Systematic exposure to existential dread in controlled contexts desensitizes fear responses, making ordinary life seem more manageable by comparison. The danger emerges when engagement becomes not exposure therapy, but obsessive rumination, when thinking about cosmic contingency shifts from occasional philosophical exercise to persistent cognitive contamination that erodes stable consciousness. The line between productive confrontation with difficult truths and destructive fixation on destabilizing ideas remains difficult to navigate, particularly for individuals already struggling with anxiety, depression, or dissociative tendencies. Film attempts to visualize Azathoth face fundamental challenges that reveal cinema's limitations when confronting entities defined by incomprehensibility and formlessness. Movies require visual representation. Cameras must point at something. Audiences must see something. Yet Azathoth's horror depends precisely on resisting visualization, on remaining conceptual threat rather than perceivable monster. Early Lovecraft film adaptations, like Roger Corman's work, largely avoided cosmic entities, focusing on psychological horror and atmospheric dread that cinematography could capture effectively. Later attempts, such as John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, approach Lovecraftian themes obliquely, depicting reality breakdown and narrative dissolution without attempting literal deity visualization. The film's climax involves protagonist recognizing himself as fictional character in horror novel, achieving meta-horror that parallels Azathoth's implication that we exist as dream content. More recent films like Color Out of Space, 2019, succeed by focusing on cosmic horror's local effects rather than cosmic entities themselves, showing how alien forces corrupt terrestrial reality without requiring the audience to comprehend the forces directly. The pattern suggests successful Lovecraft cinema requires indirection, implication, and accepting that some horrors work better unseen. Video games have achieved remarkable success adapting cosmic horror through interactivity that shifts emphasis from visualization to experience and player agency's gradual dissolution. Bloodborne, 2015, represents perhaps the most sophisticated Lovecraftian game, beginning as gothic horror before revealing cosmic horror as true framework. Players discover their reality exists within Dream, that the gods they fight are themselves subject to higher cosmic principles, that knowledge corrupts rather than empowers. The game's insight mechanic makes this literal. As players accumulate forbidden knowledge, their perception changes, revealing enemies and details previously invisible. But high insight also increases vulnerability and madness. The player experiences epistemological progression, mirroring Lovecraft's characters, initial confidence, giving way to terrible comprehension that knowing makes things worse. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, implements sanity mechanics where encountering cosmic horror degrades the player's perception, causing the game itself to glitch, generating fake error messages, and breaking the fourth wall. These mechanical innovations translate cosmic horror's psychological effects into gameplay experience rather than mere narrative. Board and card games create structured systems for engaging cosmic horror themes while maintaining game functionality that requires clear rules and achievable objectives. Arkham Horror and Eldritch Horror position Azathoth as ultimate threat, most difficult Ancient One, to prevent from awakening, its emergence typically ending games in immediate defeat for all players. The games create cooperative scenarios where players work together, investigating mysteries, closing dimensional gates, gathering resources to prevent cosmic catastrophe. Azathoth's game function as unwinnable endgame condition captures something of Lovecraft's vision. You don't fight the blind idiot god. You desperately try maintaining status quo, knowing eventual failure becomes inevitable given sufficient time. The cooperative mechanics also reflect cosmic horror's implications, facing existential threats that dwarf individual capability requires collective effort, yet collective effort ultimately proves insufficient against forces operating at scales beyond human influence. These games translate cosmic horror into social experience, groups of players bonding through shared failure against overwhelming odds, creating community around confronting the unconfrontable. Music across genres, from death metal to dark ambient, has found cosmic horror's themes remarkably adaptable to sonic experimentation and atmospheric world-building. Death metal bands like Morbid Angel explicitly reference Lovecraft's entities in album titles like Blessed Are the Sick, featuring tracks about Azathoth. The genre's sonic palette, blast beats suggesting chaos, guttural vocals evoking inhuman utterance, dissonant harmonies creating musical instability, maps effectively onto cosmic horror's aesthetic. Dark ambient and drone artists like Atrim Kossary create soundscapes that evoke impossible spaces and temporal dissolution without requiring lyrics or narrative. These compositions use extended tones, processed field recordings, and subsonic frequencies to generate physical responses in listeners, vibrations felt in chest and skull that bypass cognitive processing to affect body directly. Some composers specifically attempt translating Lovecraft's descriptions into sound. The thin, monotonous piping of demon musicians becomes sustained high frequencies. The muffled, maddening drums become low-frequency pulses. These sonic experiments recognize that music accesses consciousness differently than narrative, that sound can generate dread without requiring comprehension in ways matching cosmic horror's philosophical project. Visual artists confronting Azathoth must solve the representation problem differently than filmmakers. Static images need not show complete forms or maintain consistent logic across sequential frames. Surrealists like H.R. Giger created biomechanical nightmares that capture alien geometry and organic horror without depicting cosmic entities directly. Contemporary artists working within Lovecraftian tradition often embrace abstraction, using fractal patterns, impossible geometries, and visual techniques, suggesting something beyond frame's boundaries. Some approach the challenge through negative space, defining Azathoth by what surrounds it rather than what it is, creating compositions where formless center organizes peripheral chaos. Digital artists exploit glitch aesthetics, corrupted renders, and algorithmically generated imagery to create visuals that feel alien to human perception, as though we're viewing outputs from senses we don't possess. The most effective visual approaches recognize they're not depicting entity, but rather depicting consciousness's failure to process entity, showing the breakdown of vision rather than the thing that breaks it. The commercialization of existential dread presents interesting paradox. Cosmic horrors, philosophical content, originally designed to disturb and destabilize, becomes merchandise, entertainment, aesthetic choice. You can purchase Azathoth plush toys, wear Lovecraft-themed clothing, display cosmic horror art in living spaces previously reserved for comforting or uplifting imagery. This commodification arguably domesticates the horror, transforming genuine existential threat into consumable product that signals subcultural affiliation without requiring actual philosophical engagement. Yet there's argument that this commercial spread serves useful function, making cosmic horror's themes accessible to wider audiences who might not seek out dense philosophical fiction, normalizing conversations about meaning, mortality, and consciousness's instability. The person wearing Azathoth t-shirt may not have read Lovecraft, but they've encountered the basic concept, reality as contingent dream, which plants seeds for potential philosophical investigation. Commerce vulgarizes, but also disseminates, spreading ideas that might otherwise remain confined to literary and philosophical niches. Successful versus failed interpretations across media reveal pattern. Works succeeding maintain philosophical core while adapting form to medium-specific strengths, while failures attempt direct translation of literary techniques that don't transfer. Film fails when trying to show cosmic entities directly, but succeeds when depicting reality breakdown cinematically through editing discontinuity, sound design creating impossible spaces, narrative structures that refuse resolution. Games fail when treating cosmic horror as mere aesthetic dressing on conventional gameplay, but succeed when mechanical systems embody cosmic horror's themes, sanity as resource that depletes through knowledge, agency revealed as illusory, victory conditions showing themselves as temporary delays against inevitable failure. Music succeeds when generating dread somatically rather than narratively, when sound itself becomes alienating force. Visual art succeeds through abstraction and implication rather than literal depiction. The pattern suggests cosmic horror requires media literacy, understanding your medium's capabilities and limitations, finding ways to generate appropriate responses through medium-specific techniques rather than attempting impossible translations. Azathoth as concept proves remarkably portable across media precisely because it remains conceptual, but each medium must reinvent rather than reproduce Lovecraft's literary strategies, finding their own paths toward making audiences experience rather than merely contemplate the horror of contingent existence dreamed by mindless chaos that might wake at any moment. Philosophy departments have increasingly engaged with cosmic horror as legitimate subject for continental philosophy discussions, particularly within existentialist, nihilist, and phenomenological frameworks. Eugene Thacker's trilogy, In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, examines horror's intersection with philosophy, arguing that cosmic horror articulates the limit of human thought, the world without us, reality that continues independently of human existence or comprehension. Thacker positions Lovecraft's entities not as mere fictional monsters, but as philosophical thought experiments exploring consciousness's relationship to being itself. Academic papers now analyze Azathoth through Heidegger's concepts of being toward death, through Levinas's notion of the absolutely other, through Melissu's speculative realism that attempts thinking reality independent of human thought. These philosophical engagements treat cosmic horror seriously as literature grappling with fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and consciousness's place in material universe. The academic legitimation transforms what was pulp fiction into proper subject for rigorous analysis, though some scholars argue this very legitimation domesticates what should remain disreputable, marginal, genuinely disturbing, rather than safely contained within academic discourse. Nihilism debates frequently invoke Azathoth as exemplar of absolute meaninglessness that challenges even philosophical nihilism's coherence. Traditional nihilism argues existence lacks inherent meaning, that values are human constructions without objective grounding, that universe demonstrates no purpose or teleology. Yet philosophical nihilism typically maintains that recognizing meaninglessness remains intellectually coherent, position one can consciously adopt and argue for. Azathoth pushes beyond this to what might be called meta-nihilism. If consciousness itself is contingent dream content, then even the position existence is meaningless loses stability because the consciousness making that claim exists too unstably to ground any claim whatsoever. This creates paradox philosophers must grapple with. Can you coherently argue for radical contingency that includes the argument's own contingency? Is there position from which to assert absolute groundlessness without that position requiring its own ground? These debates reveal Azathoth functioning as philosophical limit case, the point where thought approaches its own impossibility and must either retreat or dissolve into the incoherence it contemplates. Physics analogies connecting Azathoth to quantum mechanics, cosmology, and theoretical frameworks demonstrate science's capacity to generate its own cosmic horror through empirical investigation. Quantum foam describes space-time at Planck scales as seething with virtual particle pairs constantly appearing and annihilating, suggesting that apparent stability at human scales conceals fundamental chaos at reality's deepest levels. Some theoretical physicists propose universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuation, that existence itself represents spontaneous accident, reality, as quantum blip that happened to persist and inflate, rather than immediately collapsing back into void. These scientific concepts eerily parallel Lovecraft's vision, apparent order emerging accidentally from underlying chaos, existence contingent on processes that neither intend nor comprehend what they generate. Vacuum energy and dark energy further disturb. Most of universe's energy exists as properties of supposedly empty space itself, invisible and undetectable except through gravitational effects, yet determining cosmos's ultimate fate. The parallel to Azathoth proves inexact but suggestive. Scientific materialism reveals universe as stranger than common sense allows, structured by principles that generate dread once their implications become clear. Psychology employs Azathoth as metaphor for unconscious mind, particularly in Jungian and psychoanalytic frameworks, exploring consciousness's relationship to its own foundations. The unconscious operates beneath awareness, generating dreams, driving behaviors, producing thoughts that consciousness experiences as autonomous rather than self-generated. If we model consciousness as surface phenomenon emerging from unconscious depths, then Azathoth becomes apt metaphor for this relationship. Consciousness exists as dream generated by unconscious mind that doesn't know it generates consciousness, whose awakening through psychosis, ego death, or traumatic dissolution destroys the conscious structures it temporarily sustained. This psychological reading makes cosmic horror personal and internal rather than cosmic and external, but the horror remains. Your consciousness depends on processes you don't control, don't understand, and that might terminate at any moment. Some psychologists argue that cosmic horror resonates so powerfully because it externalizes and cosmicizes anxieties we already feel about our own minds, the sense that I am passenger rather than driver, that consciousness observes more than it controls, that the self is fragile construct sustained by biological and neurological processes indifferent to the person they accidentally generate. Comparative religion courses increasingly include Lovecraft's mythology alongside traditional religious systems as example of how modern secular culture constructs meaning-making frameworks. The Cthulhu mythos gets analyzed as 20th century mythology, possessing many structural features of traditional religions: cosmology, explaining existence, pantheon of powerful entities, sacred texts, the Necronomicon and others, specialized knowledge requiring initiation, ritual practices, communities of believers, yet it inverts traditional religion's functions, where religion typically provides comfort, meaning, and moral framework. Lovecraft's mythology systematically removes these consolations. This makes the mythos valuable for comparative religion precisely because it demonstrates that mythological structures can serve purposes other than reassurance, that humans create not just stories confirming our significance, but also stories acknowledging our insignificance. Some scholars argue Lovecraft constructed first truly post-religious mythology, framework acknowledging scientific materialism's truth, while recognizing that framework provides no comfort, meaning, or value beyond its descriptive accuracy. Literary theory approaches cosmic horror through postmodern and posthumanist lenses, emphasizing decentered subjectivity and human consciousness as contingent rather than central. Postmodern theorists note Lovecraft's entities deconstruct anthropocentric assumptions. Humanity occupies no privileged position cosmically. Human categories prove inapplicable to alien realities. The coherent self dissolves when confronting radical alterity. Posthumanism finds in cosmic horror a literature that takes seriously the possibility of consciousness radically unlike human consciousness, that refuses anthropomorphizing the non-human, that imagines ways of being so fundamentally different from human being that encounter generates not understanding but epistemological breakdown. These theoretical approaches position Lovecraft as more philosophically sophisticated than his pulp fiction publication venues might suggest, as writer grappling seriously with questions about consciousness, reality, and meaning that continue occupying academic philosophy. The risk in these appropriations is sanitizing the horror through interpretation, explaining what makes cosmic horror disturbing, potentially diffuses the disturbance, makes it manageable, converts visceral dread into intellectual puzzle. Internet culture has embraced cosmic horror through memes, ironic worship, and genuine anxiety that blur boundaries between performance and belief. The Cthulhu for President memes position cosmic entities as preferable to human politicians through darkly comic logic. Why not vote for honest about indifference rather than pretending to care? Subreddits devoted to cosmic horror mix creative writing, philosophical discussion, ironic cultism, and occasional expressions of genuine till existential distress in ways that resist clear categorization. Some participants perform cosmic horror fandom while maintaining comfortable distance from its implications. Others report genuine psychological impact, intrusive thoughts about existence's contingency, derealization episodes triggered by contemplating the concepts. The internet's capacity for recursive irony means sincerity and performance become impossible to distinguish. Someone posting about worshipping Azathoth might be joking, might be seriously engaging with the concept as thought experiment, might be experiencing actual distress, or might be performing some combination of all three simultaneously. This ambiguity itself mirrors cosmic horror's epistemological instability, creating communities where nobody can be certain whether others genuinely believe or are merely performing belief, where the distinction between genuine and performed existential dread loses clear boundaries. As we turn to examining why these ideas persist and disturb across nearly a century, we must recognize that academic appropriation attempts making cosmic horror safe for study, while the concepts themselves resist domestication, continuing to generate genuine unease in readers and scholars who engage with them seriously enough to follow philosophical implications toward their most unsettling conclusions. Azathoth disturbs us more profoundly than other cosmic entities because it attacks not specific fears, but rather the foundation upon which all fears, hopes, and meanings rest. Cthulhu threatens humanity with conquest or destruction, terrible certainly, but comprehensible as external threat against which defense might theoretically be mounted. Nyarlathotep deceives and manipulates, disturbing but operating within framework where agency, intention, and resistance remain meaningful categories. Yog-Sothoth knows, all yet maintains some relationship with linear time and space that allows for conceptualization. Azathoth alone undermines the possibility of meaning itself by revealing existence as contingent dream of unconscious entity whose awakening would not destroy reality, but reveal reality never possessed the stability we mistakenly attributed to it. This distinction proves crucial. We can psychologically process external threats, even overwhelming ones, because processing occurs within stable framework of existing consciousness confronting dangers. Azathoth threatens the framework itself, suggesting consciousness and its processing mechanisms exist only provisionally, accidentally, subject to termination without warning or cause. No defense strategy, no coping mechanism, no philosophical acceptance can address this threat because all strategies, mechanisms, and acceptances occur within the consciousness revealed as unstable. The simulation argument and contemporary resonance demonstrate how 21st century technology has generated new contexts, making Lovecraft's century-old nightmare feel more relevant than ever. Philosopher Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis proposes that if technological civilizations can create detailed computer simulations containing conscious entities, and if such civilizations typically create many simulations, then statistically we are more likely to exist within simulation than base reality. This generates similar vertigo to Azathoth mythology. Our reality might be artificial construct created by entities whose purposes we cannot know, operating according to rules subject to change or termination at creator's discretion. The simulated consciousness cannot know it's simulated. Any evidence it examines exists within simulation. Any logic it employs operates according to simulated parameters. Replace simulation with dream and programmers, with unconscious dreamer, and you've recovered Lovecraft's vision. The simulation argument makes cosmic horror's central anxiety newly plausible to audiences raised on digital technology, who intuitively understand that detailed simulated realities might be possible, that consciousness might be a computational process that could run on various substrates, including ones we don't recognize. Existentialism versus cosmic horror reveals philosophical tension between authenticity and contingency, between creating meaning and recognizing meaning's groundlessness. Existentialist philosophy, particularly Sartre and Camus, acknowledges universe lacks inherent meaning while insisting humans can and must create meanings through authentic choice and commitment. Camus' Sisyphus finds meaning in the struggle itself, affirming existence through conscious rebellion against absurdity. Existentialism requires stable enough consciousness to make authentic choices, coherent enough self to commit to projects, sufficient ontological ground for meaning creation to function. Cosmic horror undermines every requirement by suggesting consciousness itself is unstable. Self is contingent fiction. Ontological ground is unconscious dream. You cannot create authentic meaning if the creating consciousness is itself inauthentic, if authenticity requires stability that existence fundamentally lacks. The confrontation between existentialism and cosmic horror marks philosophy's limit. Existentialism represents humans' furthest philosophical reach toward accepting meaninglessness while maintaining human dignity. Cosmic horror suggests dignity requires illusions about stability that reality doesn't support. Neither position proves philosophically refutable, creating permanent tension between will to meaning and suspicion that meaning-making occurs on ground too unstable to support the structures consciousness builds upon it. Modern anxieties about artificial intelligence, climate collapse, and meaning-making in crisis find expression through cosmic horror frameworks that provide vocabulary for nameless dreads. AI development raises questions about consciousness, agency, and control that parallel cosmic horror's themes. We create intelligences we may not understand, that may develop goals misaligned with human welfare, that could render humanity obsolete or extinct, not through malice, but through indifference, or through pursuing objectives that happen to conflict with human survival. Climate collapse demonstrates humanity confronting consequences of systems we initiated but cannot control, processes that will continue regardless of our desires, futures where human meaning making becomes impossible because humans don't survive to make meanings. Economic precarity, political instability, pandemic vulnerability all generate sense of existing within systems too complex to understand or control, where individual agency proves meaningless against forces operating at scales dwarfing personal or even collective human action. Cosmic horror provides metaphors for this contemporary situation. We're not fighting cosmic entities, but we are confronting systems and processes that dwarf our comprehension, that don't care about our survival, that we cannot escape because they constitute the conditions of our existence. The psychological appeal of cosmic insignificance presents paradox. Why do some people find relief or even comfort in ideas that should generate maximum existential dread? Several mechanisms seem operative. First, cosmic insignificance absolves responsibility. If nothing ultimately matters, then individual failures carry no cosmic weight. Personal shortcomings become cosmically irrelevant. The pressure to achieve significance lifts entirely. Second, shared insignificance creates egalitarian framework. Everyone from most powerful to most powerless shares equally meaningless status within larger cosmos, eliminating hierarchies of significance. Third, accepting worst-case scenario eliminates anxiety about possibilities. If you've already confronted absolute meaninglessness, conventional disappointments seem manageable by comparison. Fourth, intellectual honesty provides its own satisfaction. Better to face hard truths than comfort oneself with false hopes, even if truths offer no consolation. Some individuals report that engaging with cosmic horror reduces their anxiety rather than increasing it, that naming the dread makes it manageable, that philosophical frameworks for understanding meaninglessness prove more tolerable than vague, undirected anxiety about life's purpose. Terror versus comfort creates philosophical and psychological tension that cosmic horror navigates brilliantly by occupying both positions simultaneously. Traditional horror generates terror through threat. Monsters attack, catastrophes loom, characters face death or suffering we identify with emotionally. Cosmic horror generates different terror through revelation. We learn truths that attack not bodies, but frameworks through which we understand existence. Yet revelation also potentially liberates. If consensus reality is dream, then social conventions lose authority. If existence lacks inherent meaning, then we're free from cosmic obligations. If consciousness is accident, then its purposes need not align with any external standard. Some readers experience cosmic horror as strangely freeing despite its disturbing content. The Azathoth mythology suggests that nothing you do matters cosmically, which means you're free to do whatever matters personally without requiring cosmic justification. This doubles back into terror. The freedom proves too absolute, lacking guardrails or guidelines, forcing consciousness to create meanings while knowing meanings are arbitrary and groundless. The oscillation between terror and comfort, between oppression by meaninglessness and liberation through it, keeps cosmic horror psychologically active, preventing simple resolution into either pure dread or pure acceptance. Living with cosmic horror becomes practical philosophy question rather than merely theoretical concern for readers deeply affected by these concepts. How does one function normally while believing or suspecting that existence is fundamentally contingent, that consciousness is unstable dream content, that reality might end without warning? Several approaches emerge in communities grappling with these questions. Some practice deliberate compartmentalization, engaging cosmic horror philosophically or aesthetically while maintaining everyday consciousness that doesn't constantly reference ultimate contingency. Others develop forms of cosmic absurdism, acknowledging meaninglessness while choosing to create meanings anyway, not through bad faith, but through conscious decision that provisional meanings suffice for provisional existence. Still others report that cosmic horror ultimately changes little practically. You still experience hunger, desire connection, feel pain, seek pleasure, regardless of metaphysical status, so pragmatic concerns dominate, despite philosophical knowledge. A few embrace paralysis, finding sustained activity impossible once convinced that all activity occurs within dream that could end momentarily. The varying responses suggest cosmic horror affects different psychologies differently, that some minds tolerate or even embrace radical contingency, while others find it cognitively destructive. The question that remains unanswered and unanswerable is whether Azathoth's awakening would constitute mercy or murder, liberation or annihilation, and whether these categories even apply coherently. Mercy suggests suffering relieved, but if existence itself is suffering, does ending existence end suffering, or merely end the experience of who suffered? Murder suggests victim wronged, but if we never existed stably enough to have rights, can we be wronged by being undreamed? Liberation suggests escape from prison, but if prison is all we've ever known and constitutes our entire ontology, does escape mean freedom or extinction? Annihilation suggests destroying what was, but if what was only ever was provisionally, does ending contingent existence annihilate anything or simply stop pretending contingency was necessity? The questions recursively undermine their own terms, because the terms presume stable enough existence for the distinctions to matter. Perhaps the deepest horror is recognizing we cannot even properly formulate the question of what would happen if the dreamer woke, because formulating questions requires consciousness that would no longer exist to receive answers. We are left contemplating not merely our own mortality, but our own potential unreality, not just fearing death, but suspecting we might never have lived except as fleeting patterns in an unconscious dream from which there is no waking because we were never truly asleep. We simply weren't, and the awakening would reveal that we aren't, that we never were, except as dreams dreamed themselves, while sleeping chaos sleeps on.